Hannah Brooks lifted the heavy cast-iron pot with both hands and set it down in the center of the bunkhouse table so hard the tin cups jumped. 12 starving men went dead silent. Not one of them had believed the fat woman off the noon stagecoach could boil water, let alone save them. "Eat," she said, "or don't. But don't you ever tell me again what I can't do." If you're watching, subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end and comment the name of your city so I can see how far Hannah's story travels tonight. The stagecoach hadn't even stopped rolling when the first man started laughing. Hannah Brooks heard it through the open window, that low, ugly sound men make when they think a woman can't hear them, and she gripped the strap tighter and said nothing. "That her," one of them called out. "Reckon it's got to be. Ain't nobody else fool enough to come to Red Creek in July." Lord Almighty, Ethan sent away for a wife, and they shipped him half of Kansas. The laughter spread down the boardwalk like a grass fire. Hannah stepped down onto the dirt with her one worn suitcase and her back straight, and she looked at every last one of them. There were maybe 9 or 10 loafing outside the mercantile, and they looked her up and down the way a man sizes a mule he don't intend to buy. "Afternoon," she said. Nobody answered her. A woman in a good dress and a better bonnet turned her face away, whispering to the woman beside her loud enough to carry. "He must be more desperate than folks said. She won't last the week. Won't last 3 days. You watch." Hannah heard all of it. She had ears, and they had never learned to whisper properly, these people who thought a heavy woman was also a deaf one. She set the suitcase down and asked the nearest man, an old fellow with tobacco in his cheek, "Which way is the Calloway Ranch, sir?" He spat first, then answered, "West. Follow the creek till the grass gives out and the cattle look like they're praying for rain. You'll know it. Worst kept land in the county." "Thank you." "Don't thank me, ma'am. I ain't done you no favor telling you." A younger one laughed. "Bet she can't even walk it. Somebody hitch up a wagon before she keels over." Hannah picked her suitcase back up. "I've walked farther on less," she said, and she started west along the creek without another word, and behind her the laughter followed until the distance ate it. She did not cry. She had promised herself in Missouri that she was finished crying, and Hannah Brooks was a woman who kept her promises, even the ones she made to nobody but herself. The ranch was worse than the old man had let on. She smelled it before she saw it, the dry rot of a place giving up. The fences leaned. A wagon sat with a broken wheel that had clearly sat broken a long while. And the cattle, what few she could count, stood ribs out in a pasture the color of old straw. A man came out of the barn wiping his hands on a rag and stopped when he saw her. He didn't laugh. She noticed that right off. It was the first thing about him she noticed, that he was the only person in the whole territory so far who hadn't laughed. "You'd be the woman from the marriage bureau," he said. "Hannah Brooks. And you'd be Ethan Calloway." "I would." He looked at her a moment longer than was polite, then seemed to catch himself doing it. "I wasn't sure you'd come. I signed a contract. I came. Most folks sign contracts they don't mean to keep. I ain't most folks." That got the smallest change in his face. Not a smile, but the ghost of the place a smile used to live. A voice behind him cut in. "This, the one boss." 3 men had drifted out from the shade of the bunkhouse. Ranch hands, all of them lean and hard-worn, and the one who'd spoken was tall, with a hat pushed back off a sunburned forehead. "This is Miss Brooks," Ethan said. "She'll be staying." The tall one looked her over and made no effort to hide his opinion. "For how long?" Cole Ethan said a warning in it. "I'm just asking what everybody's thinking, boss. We can barely feed the men we got. Now there's another mouth, and that particular mouth—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. The other 2 hands snickered. Hannah set her suitcase down in the dust for the second time that day. "That particular mouth," she said, walking toward Cole, slow and even, "has fed 40 men off a broken stove in a railroad boarding house for 2 years. That particular mouth has stretched a sack of flour a week past when the flour should have quit. So you go on and worry about your own mouth, mister, and I'll worry about feeding the lot of you. Now where's the kitchen?" Cole's grin faltered. She asked you a question, Ethan said quietly. Cole jerked his chin toward the main house. Through there, ain't much. Ain't much never stopped me. The kitchen was a disgrace, and Hannah stood in the doorway of it and let herself feel the size of the thing she'd walked into. Flies. A stove gone cold and greasy. A pantry with 3 sad shelves. She opened the first and found weevils in the meal. She opened the second and found nothing at all. Ethan had followed her in, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands like a man at a funeral. I know it's bad, he said. When did these men last eat a hot meal, a real one? He was a long time answering. I don't rightly recall. Ethan. The way she said his name plain and level seemed to catch him off guard. Cook quit in the spring, he admitted. We've been eating cold biscuit and whatever we could shoot. The men are worn down to nothing. Half of them would have left already, except there's no wages owed anywhere else either, so a fella might as well starve here as starve somewhere new. He turned the hat in his hands. I'll be straight with you, Miss Brooks, seeing as you came all this way. This ranch is dying. I sent for a wife because a partner in the marriage bureau said a married man could get a loan, a single man couldn't, and I was drowning enough to try anything. I didn't send for a wife because I had anything to offer one. I ain't got a thing to offer you. I'm sorry. You ought to know that before the sun sets, and it's too late to think on it. Hannah looked at him for a long moment. You just told me the truth when a lie would have served you better, she said. You know how rare that is. Rare don't feed nobody. No, but it tells me what kind of man I married. She rolled up her sleeves. Now, I need lard salt whatever meat you got, and every man on this place carrying water to me for the next hour. Can you manage that, Mr. Calloway? You mean to cook, tonight. I mean to cook tonight. There ain't hardly anything to... There's always something. There's always enough if a body knows how to stretch it. Water, Ethan. And send me the meanest one first. That tall one, Cole. Ethan almost smiled again. You sure about that? I'm always sure about the mean ones. They're just hungry men who forgot somebody used to feed them. Cole came because Ethan made him come, and he came with an attitude, hauling a bucket and setting it down with a slosh. Water, he said. Anything else? Want me to churn butter with my teeth? You always this sour, or is today special? Ma'am, I ain't ate a thing worth the name since April. Sour's about all I got left. Hannah stopped what she was doing and looked at him. Really looked. And whatever she saw there, it softened something in her face. What's your mother's name, Cole? He blinked. What? Your mother. She living? No, ma'am. She passed when I was 9. She cooked for you before. Cole's jaw worked. For a second, the mien fell right off him, and there was just a boy underneath it. She made a beef and barley thing. Winters. I ain't thought about it in years. Beef and barley? Hannah nodded slow. I can't do beef tonight, you got nothing to spare. But I can do something with what's here that'll put you in mind of it. You'll see. You go on and carry me that water, and you tell those other 2 to quit hiding and get in here. Cole stood there a beat longer than he needed to. Why are you being decent to me? He asked. I was ugly to you out there. Because you were hungry, Hannah said, already turning back to the stove. And hungry men say things their bellies mean, not their hearts. Water, Cole. He went and he came back with the other 2, and he didn't say a smart word again. For the next 2 hours, the kitchen of the Calloway Ranch came back to life for the first time in a season. Hannah worked like a woman possessed. She scoured the stove till the iron shone. She found the salt pork and cut the good from the bad. She soaked the weevil-shot meal and skimmed the ruined part and saved the rest. She found onions gone soft in a bin and told a hand named Willis that soft onions were the sweetest kind, and he'd learn that if he lived long enough. You always talk while you cook? Willis asked. I always talk. Cooking's just what my hands do while my mouth runs. The men laughed, and it startled them, the sound of it, like they'd forgotten they could. She made a stew out of near nothing. Salt pork and the soft onions and a handful of dried beans she found in a crock and set to boil early, and hardtack crumbled in to thicken it. and salt and pepper she found, and something green she'd pulled from a wild patch by the door that made Cole squint. "That a weed? That's wild sorrel, and my grandmother would have boxed your ears for calling it a weed. Now hush and set the table. There's plates. Tin plates. Then set the tin plates. A man eats better off a set table, even a poor one." By the time the sun sat low and orange behind the mountains, 12 men were filing into the bunkhouse and sitting down to a table that had been wiped clean and laid with tin plates and a pot in the center that steamed and smelled like something a man's own mother might have made. Nobody moved at first. They just looked at it. And then Hannah lifted that heavy cast-iron pot with both hands and set it down so hard in the center of the table that the tin cups jumped and every man went silent. "Eat," she said, "or don't. But don't you ever tell me again what I can't do." For a moment, nobody breathed. Then Cole reached out and he ladled a bowl and he took a spoonful and he stopped. He stopped and he stared into the bowl, and this hard young man who hadn't cried since he was 9 years old and lost his mother put his other hand flat on the table like the room had tilted under him. "Cole," Ethan said. "It's fine," Cole said, and his voice cracked right down the middle of the word. It's fine. Ma'am, it's—" He couldn't finish. He shook his head and ate fast the way a starving man eats when he's ashamed of how bad he needs it. And then they all did. 12 men who had lived on cold biscuit and buried hope fell on that stew like it was the first food ever made, and the only sound in the bunkhouse for a long while was spoons on tin and the low animal noise of men finally being fed. Hannah stood back against the wall with her arms crossed and watched them, and her face gave away nothing, but her eyes were bright. Willis went back for thirds and then looked stricken. "Is there, ma'am? Is it all right if there's others, ain't it yet?" "There's plenty. I made plenty. You eat till you're full, Willis. Every one of you. You hear me, full. I don't ever again want to see a full pot and a hungry man in the same room. Not on this ranch. Not while I'm standing in it." Ethan Calloway had not touched his bowl. He sat at the head of his own table, and he watched his men eat, and he watched the woman who had walked 10 miles in July heat to a place that had laughed her out of town and had spent her first evening turning nothing into enough. "You ain't eating?" Hannah said to him. "I'm watching." "Watching don't feed nobody. You told me that yourself." That pulled a real laugh out of him. Short and surprised, and 1 or 2 of the men glanced up because they hadn't heard the boss laugh in longer than they could recall. Ethan picked up his spoon. He ate 1 bite. Then he set the spoon down and pressed the back of his hand against his mouth and looked away toward the window. And Hannah understood, and she had the grace not to say a word about it. Later, when the men had drifted off to their bunks fuller than they'd been in months, Ethan found her scrubbing the pot by lamplight. "You didn't have to do all that tonight," he said. "You could have rested. Nobody would have faulted you." "I'd have faulted me." "The men were cruel to you today. Cole especially. The whole town was." "The whole town don't have to eat my cooking. The men do." She wrung out the rag. "And Cole's not cruel. Cole's grieving and he don't know it. There's a difference if you look." Ethan leaned against the doorframe and studied her like she was something he couldn't quite read. "Can I ask you something, Miss Brooks?" "You can ask. Why'd you come truthful? A woman like you." He stopped hearing it and started over. "A woman with your gift. You could have cooked in any boarding house in Kansas City and been paid fair for it and had a room and a bed and never had to hear one ugly word from a soul. Why here? Why a dying ranch and a broke stranger and a town full of people laughing at you?" Hannah was quiet a moment, her hands still in the gray water. "You want the truth?" "I'd take it kindly. My whole life folks looked at me and decided everything about me before I ever said a word. Decided I was slow. Decided I was lazy. Decided I couldn't dance or couldn't work or couldn't be loved all off the size of me, like a body's worth was something you could weigh on a scale." She lifted the pot and set it upside down to dry. "And I spent a long time trying to prove them wrong, cooking harder, working longer, making myself so useful nobody could send me off. And you know what I learned?" "What's that?" "You can't prove your worth to people who already decided you don't have any. It's a fool's errand. You'll die tired, and they'll still be talking." She turned and faced him. So I quit trying to prove anything. I decided instead I was going to go somewhere that needed me. Not somewhere that wanted me. Somewhere that needed me. And a needing place don't have the luxury of laughing long. It gets hungry enough it'll thank whatever hand fills the pot no matter the size of it. She dried her hands. Your marriage bureau said you were drowning. Drowning men don't judge the rope. That's why I came here, Ethan Calloway. Not for romance. Not for a warm feeling. I came because you needed me, and being needed is the closest thing to being loved that this world ever let me hold. Ethan didn't answer for a long while. That's the saddest true thing I ever heard a person say, he finally managed. It ain't sad, it's just how it is. And how it is turned out all right, seeing as I got fed 12 grown men tonight and made one of them cry into his supper. She almost smiled. Go to bed, Mr. Calloway. Morning comes early on a ranch or so, I'm told. He went as far as the door and stopped. Miss Brooks. Hannah. If we're married, it's Hannah. Hannah. He said it careful like it might break. Those people in town, the ones who laughed. He turned his hat in his hands one more time. They're going to be sorry. I don't know how yet, but I know it the way I know weather's coming. They laughed at the wrong woman. Hannah looked at him across the dim little kitchen, this grieving man in a dying place who was the only soul in the whole territory who hadn't laughed. Get some rest, Ethan, she said softly. We've got a ranch to save. And that first night in a kitchen, everyone had written off in a marriage nobody believed in on a ranch the whole town had already buried Hannah Brooks. Banked the fire, blew out the lamp, and lay down in a strange bed in a strange house 10 miles from the last place that had laughed at her. She did not cry. She had promised herself she was finished crying. But she lay awake a long while listening to the sound of 12 fed men sleeping deep and easy through the thin walls, and somewhere in that sound for the first time in more years than she cared to count. Hannah Brooks felt something she'd near forgotten the shape of. She felt like she was home. Morning came to the Calloway Ranch the way Hannah had been warned it would, which was to say it came ugly and early, and she was up before it. She had the stove going before the first rooster found its voice. And by the time Ethan Calloway came down the stairs pulling his suspenders up over his shoulders, the smell of frying salt pork and something sweet had already climbed the house and filled it. He stopped on the bottom step. You're up? I'm always up. What's the mystery in it? There's no mystery. It's just... He rubbed the back of his neck. The last cook we had, I'd have to bang on her door with the sun already high, and half the time she'd not come at all. Then the last cook you had wasn't hungry the way I've been hungry. She slid a plate in front of him, and he looked down at it like a man handed a thing he'd forgotten existed. Eggs and biscuit and pork gone crisp at the edge, and a spoon of dark preserves she'd found in the back of the pantry, gone half to sugar. Eat. And don't you go telling me you'll eat later. Later's a lie a busy man tells his own belly. There were eggs. There were 4 hens out back nobody's been gathering from, so there were eggs enough for the men and a few besides. Somebody's been letting good food rot on this place. Ethan and I intend to find out who and put a stop to it. Ethan sat down slow. He ate the first bite the same careful way he'd eaten the stew the night before, like he half expected somebody to take it from him. Then he ate the rest of it fast, and when he was done, he set his fork across the empty plate and looked at it a moment. I forgot, he said quietly. Forgot what? That mornings could be like this. That a man could wake up and there'd be something waiting that wasn't just more work and less hope. He looked up at her. I don't know how to say thank you for a plate of eggs without sounding like a fool. Then don't say it. Just go run your ranch and let me run my kitchen, and we'll both do our jobs and call it square. But Ethan didn't get up right away. Hannah, there's something I ought to tell you before the men come in. About the money. I figured we'd get to the money. We're near the bottom of it. Truthful bottom. I've got maybe $80 to my name and 40 of it's owed to the mercantile in town for feed we already ate through. The banknote comes due in the fall, and I don't have the half of it. If the cattle don't fetch a good price at the autumn sale, and they won't thin as they are, then there's no ranch by winter. There's no ranch, and there's no wages, and every man out in that bunkhouse is turned out onto the road. He said it flat, the way a man says a thing he's on the notion that a married man could borrow where a single man couldn't. And now you're here, and I've looked you in the eye and I can't hold to that notion in good conscience. It ain't fair to use you like a signature on a loan. Hannah pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Show me the books. He blinked. The books? The ledgers, the accounts, whatever you keep the numbers in. Show me. They're a mess, Hannah. I ain't got a head for figures. Never did. My wife... He stopped. Sarah kept the books. When she passed, they just sort of piled up. I do my best, but I couldn't tell you within $50 what this place takes in or spends. Then it's a wonder you've lasted this long, and a bigger wonder you lasted it honest. She held out her hand across the table. Show me the books, Ethan. You cook a man's supper, you learn what's in his pantry. I've cooked you breakfast now, so I've earned a look at what's in your accounts. Fair's fair. He fetched them because he didn't have a reason not to, and he set a stack of water-stained ledgers and loose receipts and unopened letters down in front of her that came near to sliding off the table. Hannah looked at the pile the way she'd looked at the filthy kitchen the night before. Like a thing to be conquered, not feared. Go on, she said. Run your ranch. I'll be here when you get back, and I'll know more than you when you do. He went, and she opened the first ledger. By the time the men came in for their noon dinner, Hannah had 4 ledgers open across the table and a stub of pencil behind her ear and a look on her face that Cole coming through the door first pulled up short at. What's all that? That, Hannah said, not looking up, is where your wages went. That stopped every man in the doorway. Cole came closer. What do you mean where our wages went? There ain't no wages. That's the whole trouble. There's no money to pay us with. There's no money now, Hannah said. But there was money. More than there should have been trouble over. You men have been going hungry and unpaid on a ranch that ain't as broke as it's been made to look. Somebody's been bleeding this place, and I don't yet know who, but I know how, and I aim to find the who before the week's out. She finally looked up at the ring of hard, tired faces staring at her. Now, dinner's on the stove, and it's beans and cornbread, and there's enough for seconds. Sit and eat and let me work. They sat. They ate. But they ate quiet, and their eyes kept drifting to the woman at the head of the table, with the ledgers and the pencil, and something in the room had changed, though not a man of them could have named it. Willis was the one who finally asked, Ma'am, you really think somebody's stealing from the boss? I think, Hannah said, turning a page, that a man who buys feed at the price this ledger says he's been paying is either the worst haggler in Wyoming, or he's paying somebody twice and keeping his mouth shut about it. And Ethan Calloway don't strike me as a fool. So we're left with the other thing. What other thing? That somebody's been robbing this man blind while he grieved and counting on his grief to keep him from ever looking close enough to notice. The bunkhouse went dead quiet. Cole set his spoon down. Show me, he said. Cole? Show me, ma'am. I've been busting my back on this place for 3 years for wages I ain't seen in 6 months. If somebody's been stealing what was owed to me, I got a right to see it with my own eyes. Hannah studied him a moment. Then she turned the ledger around and pushed it across the table and put the pencil tip on a column of figures. There, she said. Feed. Look at what he's paying per hundredweight. Now look here. She flipped back a year. That's what he paid the season before. Same feed, same supplier, same everything. You see the difference? Cole looked. His lips moved as he worked the numbers, and then his face changed. That's near double. Near double. And it started right about when... She flipped forward again. Right about the spring Sarah Calloway passed, and Ethan stopped being able to look at a ledger without it hurting him. Somebody saw a grieving man who'd quit watching, and they helped themselves. Cole sat back slow. Who? That's the question, ain't it? And I'll have the answer, but not by supper, so eat your dinner, Cole. A man can't hunt on an empty stomach. When Ethan came in from the south pasture at the end of the day, dust-caked and bone-tired, he found Hannah waiting for him at the kitchen table with the ledgers closed in a neat stack and her hands folded on top of them. You look like a woman with news, he said. "I've got news. Sit down. You'll want to be sitting." He sat. "You've been robbed, Ethan Calloway. Steady and careful and for near 2 years running. Somebody's been overcharging you on feed and supplies and pocketing the difference, and it's cost you—" She opened the top ledger to a page she'd marked, "By my count, better than $400 over 2 seasons, maybe more. Some of these receipts are so smudged I can't be sure." Ethan stared at the number. $400, he repeated. "At least. Hannah, $400 that's the banknote. That's the whole—" His voice failed him. "That's the difference between a ranch and no ranch. That's my men's wages. That's—" He stood up so fast the chair scraped. Who did it? Tell me the name, and I'll ride into town tonight and do what, get yourself hanged for shooting a man you can't prove a thing against." Hannah stayed seated calm as still water, and her calm was a hand on his chest. "Sit down, Ethan." "How can I sit down?" "Because charging off angry is exactly what a thief prays his mark will do. An angry man makes noise. A quiet one makes trouble." She patted the chair he'd knocked back. "Sit. We're going to do this my way, and my way is patient, and my way works. Now sit down before you fall down. You look half dead on your feet." Ethan sat, but his hands were shaking, and Hannah reached across the table and put one of hers over both of his, and he went still. "You didn't fail her," Hannah said quietly. "What?" "Your wife, Sarah. You've been sitting on top of a robbery for 2 years, telling yourself the ranch was dying because you weren't good enough to save it. Because you weren't the man she was married to. I heard it in how you talk. Well, I'm telling you now plain so you hear it once and hold on to it. You didn't fail. You were robbed. There's a world of difference between a man who couldn't and a man who was cheated, and you've been living on the wrong side of that line for 2 years, and it's near killed you." Ethan Calloway looked at the tabletop for a long, long moment. "I don't know who did it," he finally said thick. "I know you don't. But I've got a strong idea, and by the time I'm sure you'll be sure too, and then we'll do something about it that sticks. Now." She squeezed his hands once and let go. "Who buys the feed? Who does the actual buying in town? You?" "No, he frowned. "I hardly ever go to town anymore. Can't stand the way they look at me. It's Merrick who does the buying. Silas Merrick. He runs the mercantile and the freight both, and he's been extending me credit these 2 years when nobody else would. I owe the man near everything. If it wasn't for Merrick, I'd have gone under a year ago." Hannah's face went very still. "The man who does all your buying," she said slowly, "is the same man who owns the store you buy from, and the freight that hauls it, and holds most of your debt besides." "That's right. And he sets the prices." "Well, yes. But he's been good to me, Hannah. When Sarah died and I couldn't hardly get out of bed, Merrick's the one who kept my account open. Kept the feed coming. Told me not to worry about the bill until I got back on my feet. A man like that?" "A man like that," Hannah said, "found himself a grieving widower who'd stopped counting, and he's been feeding him just enough to keep him alive and in debt both. He didn't keep your account open out of kindness, Ethan. He kept it open because a dead ranch pays no bills, but a dying one pays forever. He's not your rescuer. He's the fox that offered to guard the hen house and's been eating 1 hen a week ever since Slow, so you'd never notice the flock thinning." Ethan sat with that. "Merrick," he said again, and this time the name came out different. "Silas Merrick. Don't say it in town yet. Don't say it to the men. Don't say it to anybody but me, because right now it's just a notion. And a notion won't hang a man, and it surely won't save a ranch. What'll save the ranch is proof. And proof is slow, and proof is quiet, and proof is exactly the kind of patient work a thief never expects from the people he's stealing from." She stood and began setting out the supper things. "So here's what we're going to do, Ethan Calloway. We're going to be the most grateful, humble, beaten-down ranch in the whole county. You're going to keep going to Merrick. And you're going to keep saying thank you. And you're going to keep being just exactly as broke and hopeless as he thinks you are. And meanwhile, I'm going to be doing something Silas Merrick never once considered." "What's that?" "Watching." The days that followed changed the Calloway Ranch faster than anyone on it could quite account for. It was the food first. It was always the food. Hannah had come to understand over a life of feeding people who didn't respect her until she did. That a fed man is a different animal from a hungry one, clear down to his soul. A hungry man is mean and small and can't see past the ache in his own gut. A fed man remembers he's a man. He stands up straighter. He gives a day's work because he's had a night's rest and a morning's meal, and because somebody at last gave enough of a damn about him to salt his food right. Within a week, the men were working like a different crew. Within 2, they'd stopped grumbling in the mornings. And somewhere in there, without a soul deciding it out loud, the shape of the whole place had shifted. The men still called Ethan boss. But when a thing needed deciding, when the well pump quit, when a heifer got sick, when a fence needed a run of new wire, they couldn't afford. The men had a way of drifting toward the kitchen, hats in hand, and asking Hannah what she reckoned. "Why are they asking you?" Ethan asked her one evening, not sore about it, just wondering. "You've never run a ranch." "They ain't asking me about ranching. Cole knows more about cattle than I'll learn in 10 years. They're asking me because I'll give them a straight answer and I won't make them feel like fools for asking." She was kneading bread, her sleeves shoved up flour to the elbow. Men'll follow a person who feeds them and won't shame them. Ain't complicated. You'd know it too if grief hadn't had you by the throat these 2 years. You keep saying that, grief, because it's true, and you keep flinching off it like a horse off a snake. She turned the dough. You loved her, Sarah. You loved her so hard that when she went, you decided some part of you was supposed to go with her, and you've been half in the ground ever since, running a ranch like a man already dead, just waiting for the body to catch up. And I'm here to tell you, Ethan Calloway, you are not dead. You're just sad. And sad, unlike dead, a person can come back from. Ethan was quiet a long time. "You're a hard woman to sit across a table from," he said finally. "So I've been told." "I didn't mean it unkind. I didn't take it unkind. It's the truest thing anybody's said to me in years." She set the dough to rise and covered it with a cloth. "Now go on to bed. And Ethan, tomorrow when you go into town for feed, I want you to take me." He turned. "Take you to town. Hannah, you know how they were. What they said. I won't have them. I know exactly how they were. That's why I want to go. I want to look at Silas Merrick with my own 2 eyes while he thinks I'm nothing but the fat wife you sent away for. Let him underestimate me. Underestimating's the only mistake that can't be undone once it's made, and I aim to let him make it good and deep before I ever let him know he made it." They rode into Red Creek together the next morning, and it went about how Ethan had feared. The whispers started before the wagon stopped. "There she is, still here. Would you believe it? Give it time. Winter'll run her off if the summer don't." Poor Ethan. Desperate men make desperate bargains. Hannah climbed down off the wagon without waiting for a hand, and she walked into the mercantile with her chin level and her eyes open, and she did not so much as glance at the women clustered by the dry goods, who went silent, and then loud again the second her back was turned. Silas Merrick was behind the counter. He was a soft-looking man, was Hannah's first thought, soft in the way that had nothing to do with weight. Soft in the smile. Soft in the voice. A big, warm handshake of a man the kind folks trust on sight and regret trusting on reflection. "Ethan?" Merrick came around the counter with his hand already out. "Good to see you. Good to see you. And this must be—" The smallest hesitation so brief, you'd miss it if you weren't watching for it, and Hannah was watching for it. The new Mrs. Calloway. Well, what a pleasure. "Silas Merrick, ma'am. If there's anything you need for that kitchen out there, you come see me. I'll set you up right." "That's kind of you, Mr. Merrick." Hannah took his hand and shook it, and gave him her warmest, dullest, most harmless smile. "Ethan's told me how good you've been to him, extending credit and all, in these hard times. Why, he says you're near the only reason the ranch is still standing." Something moved behind Merrick's eyes. Pleasure. The pleasure of a man hearing his own story told back to him just the way he'd planted it. "Well now, I do what I can for my friends. Ethan's had a rough go. A man does what he can." "He surely does." Hannah kept smiling. I don't suppose you'd mind if I looked around a spell while you two do your business. I do love a well-stocked store. Look all you like, Mrs. Calloway. Look all you like. And Hannah looked. She wandered the aisles slow and harmless, a big soft woman admiring the goods. And while she did, she read the price cards on every shelf, and she noted the freight tags on the crates in back, and she listened to every word that passed between Ethan and Silas Merrick at the counter. And by the time she climbed back into the wagon, she knew 3 things she hadn't known that morning. She waited until they were clear of town before she said any of them. He's charging you 30% over the shelf price for your feed, she said. I read the card on the barrels myself. Then I heard him quote you the number. It's 30% higher, and he wrote it in your account like it was the fair rate. Ethan's jaw tightened. You're sure? I read numbers the way you read weather, Ethan. I'm sure. That's the first thing. Here's the second. Those freight crates in the back, the ones his own line hauled, the shipping tags are still on some of them. And the shipping cost he's been charging you. It's on your ledger. I checked it against my memory this morning. It is more than twice what the tag says he paid the railroad. He's charging you to haul feed at triple what it costs him to haul it, and pocketing the rest. That son of a... And the third thing... Hannah folded her hands in her lap. The third thing's the worst, and I want you calm before I say it, so take a breath. Ethan took a breath. While I was in the back, Hannah said, I saw a stack of papers on his desk through the office door. I didn't touch them. I wouldn't. But I saw the top one, and it was a deed, a land deed. And the land described on it Ethan. The boundaries, the creek line, the section numbers. She turned and looked at him. It was your land. Silas Merrick has a deed to your ranch sitting on his desk made out and waiting, and all it's missing is the day your banknote comes due and you can't pay it. The wagon rolled a good 100 yards in silence. He means to take the ranch, Ethan said, and his voice had gone somewhere very quiet and very cold. That's the whole play. Not the money, the land. He's been bleeding me slow so I can't pay the note so that when it comes due, he can take the whole thing for the price of the debt. He wants my land. He wants your land, and he's been 2 years in the taking of it, and he's near to done. Hannah reached over, and for the second time, laid her hand over his, where it gripped the reins white-knuckled. But here's what Silas Merrick don't know, Ethan Calloway. He don't know that the fat wife you sent away for out of desperation can read a ledger better than any banker in Wyoming. He don't know that I've already found the $400 he stole, and I know how he stole it. And he surely don't know that starting today, he stopped stealing from a beaten man. Her hand tightened on his and started stealing from me. And I don't lose Ethan. Not at this. This is the one thing in all my life the world could never take from me, no matter how they laughed. I can add, and I can wait, and I can win. That night, the kitchen of the Calloway Ranch held a war council, though the men who came to it thought they'd only come for supper. Hannah fed them first. She always fed them first. Then when the plates were clean and the coffee poured, she stayed standing while the men sat, and she told them. She told them about the feed prices. She told them about the freight. She told them about the $400, and she watched their faces harden as they understood one by one that the wages they'd gone without for 6 long months had been stolen out of their pockets by a smiling man in town who'd extended their boss credit out of the goodness of his heart. And then she told them about the deed. He means to take the whole place, she said. This place, where you sleep, where you work, the only home some of you have got. He means to take it out from under Ethan the day the note comes due and turn every one of you out onto the road, and he means to do it legal with a piece of paper a judge would honor, because that's the wickedest part of it. It's a robbery, but it's a robbery dressed up in the law's own clothes, and a thief in the law's clothes is the hardest kind there is to hang. For a moment nobody spoke. Then Cole stood up. He stood up slow, and he set his hat on the table, and when he spoke his voice shook, but not with fear. I got a question, ma'am. He looked at her. You come here a week ago. Town laughed you off the coach. I was ugly to you my own self, and I ain't proud of it. You didn't owe this ranch one thing. You could have took one look at the book, seen how bad it was, and got right back on the next coach, and nobody would have faulted you." He swallowed. "Why are you fighting for us, for me, after how we treated you?" And every man in the room went still, because it was the question all of them had been carrying, and none of them had had the courage to set down. Hannah looked at Cole for a long moment. "You want the honest answer or the pretty one?" "Honest, ma'am. Always honest." "Then here's honest." She set her hands flat on the table and leaned in. "My whole life people looked at me and saw something to laugh at, something less, something to underestimate. And you know what I learned from a lifetime of being underestimated, Cole? I learned exactly what it feels like to be a person the world's decided don't matter." She straightened. "And when I walked onto this ranch, I saw 12 men the world had decided don't matter. Broke, hungry, working for a boss too grieved to fight for you. Turned out and forgot. I looked at you, Cole, mean and sour on that first day, and I didn't see a mean man. I saw a person somebody stopped feeding. And I have spent my entire life knowing that feeling, and I will be damned before I stand by and watch a fat, smiling thief in town do to you what the whole world already did to me." Her voice cracked just once, and she let it. "That's why I'm fighting for you. Because somebody should have fought for me and nobody did, and I decided a long time ago that if the world wouldn't give me the fight I needed, I'd become the fight somebody else needed. And here you are. And here I am. So no, I ain't leaving. Silas Merrick is going to have to come through me to get this ranch, and I'll tell you what, boys." She almost smiled. "There's a lot of me to come through." For a second the room was silent. Then Cole laughed. A real laugh, cracked open and wet-eyed. And then Willis laughed, and then they all did, and the sound of it filled the bunkhouse and rolled out the open door into the Wyoming dark. 12 men and 1 woman laughing in the face of a thing that ought to have crushed them. And it was in that moment, though, not one of them said it, that the Callaway Ranch stopped being a place where men waited to lose and became a place where men had decided finally to fight. "All right," Cole said, wiping his eyes. "All right, so what do we do?" "You tell us. Whatever it is, we're with you." "We're with you, ma'am," Willis said. "With you," said another and another, until it went around the whole table. Hannah felt something rise in her throat that she pushed back down because there was work to do and crying could wait. Crying could always wait. "Here's what we do," she said. "First, nobody breathes a word of this in town. Not to a soul. As far as Silas Merrick is concerned, this is the same beaten ranch it was a week ago, and I'm the same useless wife, and Ethan's the same broke widower saying thank you for credit. We're going to let him keep thinking he's won right up until the day he loses. You understand me? We smile, we say thank you, we play dead, because a fox don't run when he thinks the henhouse is already his." "Playing dead," Cole said. "I can do that. I've been doing it 6 months. "Good. Second." She pulled out a ledger and opened it to a fresh page. "We start our own set of books, from today. Every price Merrick charges we write down. Every freight tag we can lay eyes on we copy. Every receipt we keep. We build a wall of paper so high and so honest that when the day comes, we don't have to accuse Silas Merrick of a thing. We just lay the paper on a judge's desk and let the numbers do the accusing. Numbers don't lie, boys, and numbers can't be intimidated, and they can't be bought, and they don't care one whit how much a man smiles. That's why I love them." "And third?" Ethan asked. He'd been quiet through all of it, watching his wife rally his men in a way he'd been unable to do for 2 years, and there was something in his face that hadn't been there when Hannah stepped off the coach. Something a person might have called hope if they'd been generous, or love if they'd been honest, though it was early yet for either to say so. "Third," Hannah said, "we get you men your wages, because I can build all the paper in the world, but paper takes time and the note comes due in the fall, and we need money before then. Real money. Money Silas Merrick can't touch and don't know about. Money that makes this ranch strong enough that when we finally do bring the fight to him, we're not fighting from our knees, we're fighting standing up." "And where's that money coming from?" Cole asked. You said yourself we're near broke. Hannah was quiet a moment. Then she said the thing that had been forming in her mind for 3 days, ever since she'd ridden out to the western sections with Ethan and seen off past the ranch's own boundary, a thing that had set her whole mind to turning. When I rode the west line with Ethan on Tuesday, she said, I saw something. Past our land, down along the flat where the survey stakes run. The railroad camp, Ethan said. They've been laying track through there since spring. Hundreds of men. Hundreds of men, Hannah agreed. And I watched them break for their noon meal, and I watched what they ate, and I've been thinking about it every hour since. She leaned in. Those men are being fed slop. Cold beans and hard bread and salt meat gone green at the edge. Fed by a contractor who don't care if they live or die so long as they lay track. I could smell it from 100 yards off, and it turned my stomach, and I've got a stomach that smelled a lot. Her eyes had gone bright. There are hundreds of hungry men not 2 miles from this kitchen, boys. Hundreds. And I am the best cook in this territory. And I have got a kitchen, and I have got a crew, and I have got exactly one thing in this world I have never once failed to do. The bunkhouse was silent. Feed people, Hannah said. I have never once failed to feed people, and I intend to feed those men. Every last one of them. And they are going to pay me to do it. And that, boy's not Merrick's Law, not the bank, not any of it. That is how we save this ranch. We're not going to beg for it. We're not going to borrow for it. We're going to cook for it. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Willis said slow, Ma'am, there's hundreds of them, and there's one of you. There's one of me, and there's 12 of you, and there's a big empty kitchen and a whole ranch full of things that need doing anyhow. You can chop wood, can't you? Haul water, peel a potato without cutting your own thumb off. I reckon. Then you're a cook now. Congratulations. She turned to Cole. And you know cattle. You know which of Ethan's stock is too thin to sell, but strong enough to butcher for meat that'd otherwise fetch nothing at market. A cow that's worth $10 sold thin is worth $30 turned into 200 meals sold hot. That's the arithmetic that's going to save us Cole. Not selling what we have for nothing. Turning what we have into something. Cole was staring at her. You've thought all this out. I've thought all this out. I've been thinking it out for 3 days while you men slept. It's what I do when I can't fix a thing today. I plan how to fix it tomorrow. She looked around the table at every worn, hopeful face. Now, this won't be easy. A camp foreman's not going to hand a ranch wife a feeding contract because she smiled at him. He's going to laugh. Same as the town laughed. Same as you laughed, Cole, that first day. He's going to take one look at me and decide I can't do it, and then, her jaw set, and then I'm going to cook one pot of something so good that the laughing stops in his throat and turns into asking how much. Because that's the only argument I've ever won in my life, and it's the only one I've ever needed. You can't argue with a hungry man's mouth once you've fed it. It won't lie for anybody. Not for pride, not for meanness, not for money. A well-fed mouth tells the truth even when the man it belongs to don't want to. Ethan spoke up then quiet. Hannah, that railroad camp. The contractor feeding those men, do you know who holds the supply contract for it? No. Should I? Ethan looked at her and his face was grim. Silas Merrick, he said. Merrick's freight line supplies that camp. He's the one feeding them slop and getting rich off it. You go out there offering to feed those men better and cheaper. Hannah, you're not just saving this ranch. He set his jaw. You're taking food right out of Silas Merrick's mouth, and a man who'd spend 2 years quietly stealing a ranch out from under a widower. A man like that don't take kindly to somebody costing him money. The second he figures out what you're doing, this stops being quiet. It stops being paper and patience. He'll come at you. Hard. Every dirty way he knows, and I expect he knows a lot of them. The bunkhouse had gone very still. Hannah stood at the head of the table, a big woman in a flour-dusted apron in a kitchen everyone had written off on a ranch the whole county had already buried. And she looked at the man she'd married a week ago out of desperation, and neither of them had expected to matter. And something passed between them that neither of them would have known how to name. Good, she said. Ethan blinked. Good? You heard me. Good. Hannah began gathering up the ledgers slow and calm, and there was iron in her, now that hadn't been there a week ago, or maybe it had always been there, and this was only the first time she'd let a room full of people see it. For 25 years, Ethan Calloway, the whole world, has looked at me and laughed and been right about exactly nothing. They said I couldn't work. I outworked them. They said I couldn't be loved. Well, we'll see about that one yet. And every single time they were wrong, and every single time I let it pass because a person can't fight the whole world at once, and I never once had a fight worth the losing. She tucked the ledgers under her arm. But now there's one man. One. With a name and a face, and a store in town, and a deed to your ranch on his desk. One man I can point at and say, that's the thief, that's the one who did it. That's the wicked, smiling son of a gun, who's stealing food out of the mouths of hungry men, and a home out from under 12 honest hands, and a life out from under a good grieving man who never did him wrong. Her voice had gone low and hard and steady as bedrock. You want to know if I'm scared of Silas Merrick coming at me? I've been coming at my whole life by people who did it for no reason but the shape of me. At least this one's got a reason. At least this one, when I beat him, it'll mean something. She started for the door, then stopped and turned back to the room full of men who were staring at her like she was something they'd never seen before and couldn't look away from. Get some sleep, boys, Hannah Brooks said. Every one of you. Because tomorrow morning we start cooking, and the day after that we ride out to that railroad camp, and we're going to feed those men the best meal they've eaten in a year. She almost smiled. And Silas Merrick is going to hear about it, and I want you all rested, because from the moment he does... She looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked back, and neither of them looked away. This ranch stops running and starts fighting, and I don't intend to lose. She went up the stairs to bed, and behind her 12 men sat in a bunkhouse that had been a graveyard of hope 2 weeks before, and now hummed with something none of them had felt in longer than they could say. And Ethan Calloway sat at the head of his own table, in his own house, on his own land, and for the first time since the day they'd lowered Sarah into the ground, he did not feel like a man waiting to die. He felt like a man with something to fight for. And 2 miles west in a camp full of hungry men, and 10 miles east in a town full of people who'd laughed and behind a counter in a mercantile where a soft-smiling man was counting money that didn't belong to him. The world went on exactly as it had, none of it yet. Knowing that everything had already changed on a ranch. Nobody had bothered to watch in a kitchen, run by a woman they'd all been fool enough to underestimate. The rooster crowed before dawn. Hannah Brooks was already up. She was always up, and she had a ranch to save. They cooked for 2 days before they rode out. Hannah wouldn't go to the railroad camp empty-handed, and she wouldn't go with something less than her best, because she knew the way. She knew most things, that she'd get exactly one chance to change a foreman's mind, and not a breath more. 1 pot, she told the men that first morning, tying her apron. That's all he'll give me. 1 pot, 1 taste, 1 chance. And if it ain't the best thing that's ever crossed that man's tongue, we ride home and this ranch dies in the fall. So we don't make it good, boys. We don't even make it real good. We make it a thing he'll be thinking about on his deathbed. Cole butchered 2 of the thin steers, the ones that would have fetched pennies at market, and he did it clean and careful, the way Hannah showed him, saving every scrap that could be saved. Willis hauled water till his arms shook. 2 of the younger hands dug through the root cellar and the wild patches along the creek, and brought back onions and sorrel and wild garlic, and a sack of last year's potatoes that had gone soft but not rotten. And Hannah cooked. She cooked like the ranch depended on it, because it did. She browned the meat in batches so it seared instead of stewing gray. She built a broth so deep and dark that Cole, walking past, stopped dead and said, "Lord, ma'am, what is that?" And she said, "That's what patience smells like." Cole, now keep walking. You're letting the heat out. By the evening of the 2nd day, she had it. She ladled a bowl and handed it to Cole first, because he'd been the meanest, and she'd learned long ago that the ones who start out meanest make the most honest judges once you've won them. Cole took a spoonful. He went still the same way he had that first night, and then his eyes came up over the rim of the bowl and found hers. "Ma'am," he said. "If that foreman don't sign, he's a fool and I'll whip him myself." "He won't be a fool. Fools don't run railroad camps. He'll be a man who's been feeding hundreds of workers garbage for a year and hating every plate of it. He knows better food when he tastes it. He just ain't had anybody offer him any." She untied her apron. "We ride at first light. Cole, you're coming. Willis, you're coming. Ethan." She looked at him. "You're staying." "Staying?" Ethan straightened. "Hannah, I'm not sending you out to that camp without—" "You're staying," she said again, gentle but immovable. "Because Silas Merrick has men watching this ranch. Not close, but watching. I've felt it 3 days now, a rider on the ridge come noon gone by supper. And if Ethan Calloway rides off toward the railroad camp, Merrick hears about it by nightfall and starts wondering why. But if it's just the fat wife taking a pot of stew somewhere—" She spread her hands. "Who watches where a woman takes her cooking? Nobody. That's the whole beauty of being underestimated, Ethan. A person can walk right past the guards because nobody thinks to guard against her." Ethan didn't like it. She could see he didn't like it. But he was learning in the short 2 weeks he'd known her that Hannah Brooks was right more often than she was comfortable, and that arguing with her was like arguing with the weather. You could shout at a storm all you liked. It rained anyway. "Take Cole's rifle," he said finally, "and come back to me, both of those, in that order." Something crossed Hannah's face quick and gone. "I'll come back," she said. They rode out at first light, the wagon heavy with 2 great covered pots, and a crate of tin bowls Hannah had scoured till they shone, and they followed the survey stakes west and south until the land flattened and the sound reached them. First the ring of hammers and the shouts of men and the great groaning of a railroad being borne out of empty country. The camp was worse up close than it had looked from a distance. Hannah had been in poor places. She'd cooked in boarding houses where the walls sweated and the rats came bold at noon. But she'd never seen men used up quite the way these men were being used up, worked from dark to dark, and fed on whatever cost the contractor least, and it settled something hard and certain in her chest as she looked at them. "There," Cole said low. "The big tent. That'll be the foreman." The foreman's name was Buck Hollis, and he was exactly the kind of man Hannah had expected, which was to say, a hard one, worn down to leather by weather and worry, and 1,000 small fights over other men's money. He came out of the tent, chewing on a cold biscuit, and he looked at the wagon, and he looked at Hannah, climbing down off it, and his face did the thing every face did. "Something I can do for you, ma'am." And under it plain as print, "What's this fat woman want, and how fast can I be rid of her?" "Buck Hollis." "That's me." "Hannah Calloway. I run the kitchen at the Calloway Ranch 2 miles east, and I've come to feed your men." Hollis laughed. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was tired. "Ma'am, I got 240 men on this line. You know what that is to feed. That's a mountain of food twice a day. I got a supply contract already comes in on the freight. You want to sell me a few chickens? I could. I don't want to sell you chickens. I want to feed your men, all 240, twice a day. Better than they've ever been fed and cheaper than you're paying now." That stopped the laugh. Hollis looked at her a second time, the way a man looks at a thing that just said something a fool wouldn't say. "Cheaper than I'm paying now. Cheaper. And better. And you don't have to believe one word out of my mouth, Mr. Hollis, because I didn't come here to talk. Talk's cheap, and everybody's had a bellyful of it. I came here to cook." She jerked her chin at the wagon. "I've got a pot back there. Made it fresh yesterday. All I'm asking is you gather however many men are on their break and let them eat it. Free. Costs you nothing. And if it ain't the best thing they've had since they left home, I'll drive right back the way I came and never trouble you again. But if it is," she let it hang, "then you and I are going to have a conversation about that supply contract." Buck Hollis looked at her for a long moment. Then he did the thing that told Hannah he was a better man than the one who'd hired him, because he was curious instead of insulted. "Ferguson," he bellowed, "ring the brake bell, and spread word there's hot food by the water wagon first. Come first served till it's gone." The bell rang, and the men came. They came the way starving men come wary and fast, both not quite believing it, and Hannah and Cole and Willis ladled that stew into shining tin bowls as quick as their hands could move. And Hannah watched the first man take the first bite. He was young, this one. Couldn't have been 20. Rail-thin, sunburned hands raw. He took a spoonful standing up, and he stopped, and he looked down into the bowl, and then he looked up at Hannah with an expression she would carry to her grave. "Ma'am," he said, "where'd you come from?" "East," Hannah said. "Eat slow. There's more." He didn't eat slow. None of them did. Word went down the line the way fire goes through dry grass, and men came faster, and the wary look fell off them one by one as they ate, and some of them went quiet. And one big rough man with gray in his beard sat right down in the dirt with his bowl, and put his hand over his eyes and didn't move for a while, and nobody troubled him about it because every man there understood. Buck Hollis ate last. He ate standing next to Hannah, one spoonful too, and he chewed slow and swallowed, and he looked out at 200 men eating the first real food they'd had in a year, and something worked in his weathered face. "How much?" he said quietly. "Let's talk in your tent, Mr. Hollis." They talked in his tent for an hour, and when Hannah came out, she had a trial contract, 30 days. 2 meals a day for the whole camp at a price that was a hair under what Merrick's freight was charging, which meant Hollis saved money, and which still, because Hannah could stretch $1, the way most folks couldn't stretch a lie, left the ranch a profit on every single plate. She didn't let herself smile until they were a mile clear of the camp. Then she let herself smile so wide, Cole laughed out loud at the sight of it. "We did it," Willis kept saying. "Ma'am, we did it. We actually 240 men twice a day. He stopped. "Ma'am, how in the world are we going to cook for 240 men twice a day?" "Same way you eat an ox," Hannah said. "One bite at a time, and we're going to need more hands, a lot more hands." She got them in town, and she got them in a way that changed Red Creek as much as it changed the ranch, though nobody saw it coming, least of all Hannah. Because Hannah didn't hire men, she hired the women. She rode into Red Creek the next morning, and she didn't go to the mercantile, and she didn't go to the church, and she didn't go anywhere. The fine ladies gathered to whisper. She went to the poor end of town, the part folks didn't look at where the widows lived, and the abandoned wives, and the women whose men had died or drunk themselves useless or lit out west and never sent for them. The women the town had decided the way towns do simply did not count. She knocked on the first door herself. The woman who answered was thin and hollow-eyed, with a baby on her hip, and 2 more behind her skirts, and she looked at Hannah with the flat suspicion of a person who'd learned that a knock at the door was usually somebody come to take something. "Whatever you're selling," the woman started. "I'm not selling, I'm hiring. My name's Hannah Calloway. I run the kitchen out at the Calloway Ranch, and I just took a contract to feed a railroad camp 240 strong twice a day, and I cannot do it alone. I need cooks. I need women who can peel and chop and stir and haul and work a long day and not quit. I'll pay a fair wage cash every week, and I'll feed you and your young ones a hot dinner besides every day you work. And I'm starting with you because you answered your own door with a baby on your hip, and 2 more behind you, and you've got the look of a woman who knows how to make nothing feed everybody." Hannah paused. "So, you want work, or you want me to go knock on the next door?" The woman stared at her. "You're the one," she said slowly. "The one they laughed at. Off the coach. I'm the one. They said you wouldn't last. They say a lot of things. You want the work or not, Mrs. Dutton? Mary Dutton." The woman's jaw worked. "My husband died on the line last spring. That same railroad. Fell under a car. They gave me nothing, not $1. Said it was his own carelessness." Her voice was flat, but her eyes weren't. "And you're telling me I could earn cash money feeding that same railroad? I'm telling you, you could earn cash money feeding those men who broke their backs alongside your husband and never got $1 either. The railroad didn't kill your man, Mrs. Dutton. Carelessness didn't either. Being worked to death on bad food and no rest killed him, and I aim to change the food part, and I'd be proud to have his widow standing next to me while I do it." Hannah held out her hand. "Fair wage. Hot dinner for your babies. Every day. Starting tomorrow at dawn. Mary Dutton looked at that outstretched hand for a long moment. Then she took it, and she gripped it hard, and something in her flat face cracked open, and she said, "I'll be there before dawn." By the end of that day, Hannah had 8 women. By the end of the week, she had 14. Widows and cast-offs and women. The town had written off women who'd been surviving on charity and pride and precious little else. And Hannah put every one of them to work and paid every one of them fair. And something happened out at the Calloway Ranch that Silas Merrick, counting his money in town, did not yet understand had happened. It stopped being a dying ranch. It became the beating heart of a whole community of people the world had thrown away. The kitchen ran now from dark to dark. 2 great fires, 4 huge kettles, 14 women and 12 men, and Hannah at the center of it all, and the food went out to the railroad camp twice a day in the wagon, and the money came back real money, cash money, and the first thing Hannah did with it was the thing she'd promised. She paid the men their back wages. She did it on a Friday evening, and she did it herself, counting the coins into each calloused hand, and when she got to Cole, he looked down at 6 months of owed wages in his palm, and his throat worked, and he couldn't say a word. "You earned every cent of it," Hannah told him, "long before I ever showed up. This ain't charity, Cole. This is what was always yours that a thief kept from you. Don't you thank me for it. You go buy your girl something pretty, and you hold your head up because you're a working man who gets paid now, and that's how it's supposed to be." Cole closed his fist around the coins. "I got no girl," he said rough. "Then get one. A man with wages in his pocket and food in his belly, any girl in this county'd be lucky. Go on." Ethan Calloway watched all of it from the edges, and Hannah caught him at it more than once, watching her with a look she didn't have a name for, and was half afraid to name. He'd changed as much as the ranch had. He stood straighter. He laughed now real laughs, and the men noticed, and it heartened them to hear it. The grief hadn't left him. Grief like that never fully leaves, but it had loosened its grip, and a man was surfacing out from under it that Hannah suspected had been down there drowning a long time. "You keep looking at me," she said to him one night when the fires were banked and the women had gone home and the ranch was quiet. "I do." "Why?" Ethan was quiet a moment. 2 weeks ago, he said, this was a dead place. I was a dead man walking around in it, and then a stagecoach came and the whole town laughed, and I looked out at the woman they were laughing at, and I thought, God forgive me. I thought they're right. She'll never save this. Nothing can save this. He looked at her across the dim kitchen. "And now there's 14 women earning honest wages who couldn't feed their kids a month ago. There's 12 men paid up who'd given up on ever seeing a dollar. There's money in a box that a thief don't know about. And there's a railroad camp full of men who'd walk through fire for you all because a woman they said couldn't boil beans walked into the worst kitchen in Wyoming and refused to see what everybody else saw." He shook his head slow. "I keep looking at you, Hannah, because I keep trying to understand how one person did all that in 2 weeks, and I can't. And I've stopped trying. Now I just look because—" He stopped himself. "Because why? Because looking at you is the first thing that's made me glad to be alive in 2 years." Ethan Calloway said, "And I'm not fool enough to look away from a thing like that." The kitchen was very quiet. Hannah felt her heart do something it had not done in longer than she could remember, and she was a woman who did not trust her heart because her heart had been laughed at too, and she pushed it down the way she'd pushed everything down her whole life. "You're tired," she said. "Go to bed, Ethan." "Hannah, go to bed." But she said it soft. And when he went, she stood alone in the kitchen a long while, and she pressed her hand flat against her own chest, and she felt it beating there, fool that it was, and she said out loud to the empty room, quiet, Don't you dare hope for that. Not that. You'll take the ranch and the wages and the women and all of it, but not that that's the one they never let you keep." And she banked the last of the fire and went up to bed, and she did not sleep well. It was 3 days after that Silas Merrick found out. He found out the way such men always find out, which was that his money got lighter, and he went looking for the reason. His freight lines contract at the railroad camp, the fat contract he'd been skimming for a year, came up for its monthly renewal, and Buck Hollis told his supplier, plain that he wouldn't be needing the food portion anymore on account of he'd found better and cheaper local. And when Merrick's man asked better and cheaper from who, Buck Hollis said, woman named Calloway. Runs a ranch kitchen east of here. Best cook in the territory. And Silas Merrick in his mercantile in his town counting his money went very, very still. He came out to the ranch himself. He came alone in a fine buggy on a bright afternoon, and he drove up to the Calloway place with a smile on his soft face, and he found it transformed from the dying husk he'd been slowly consuming into something loud and living fires going, and women working, and the smell of good food thick in the air, and a wagon being loaded for the evening run to the camp. He climbed down from his buggy, and his smile never wavered, and he found Hannah at the center of it all, with her sleeves rolled up and flour to her elbows. "Mrs. Calloway," he called out warmly. My, what a change out here. What a change." Hannah looked up at him, and she kept her face soft and dull and harmless. The same face she'd shown him in the store, and she said, "Why, Mr. Merrick, what brings you all the way out to us?" "Oh, just neighborly curiosity. Word travels. And I heard the most remarkable thing that you'd taken to feeding the railroad camp. The whole camp." He spread his hands, all friendly wonder. "I said to myself, that can't be right. That's 200 men and more. Surely not." 240, Hannah said pleasantly. "Twice a day. 240. Merrick's smile stayed put, but something had gone cold and busy behind his eyes. "Well, that's ambitious. That's very ambitious for a ranch this size. I do hope you know what you've taken on, Mrs. Calloway. Feeding an operation that large, the supply alone, the logistics. Why, it's the kind of thing that's ruined bigger outfits than this one. Businesses fail every day reaching past their grasp. I'd hate to see this place bite off more than it could chew and end up worse than it started." "That's kind of you to worry, Mr. Merrick." "I worry about all my friends." He looked around, taking it in, counting, calculating. "And Ethan, how's Ethan bearing up under all this activity?" "Ethan's doing well. Better than he has in years." "Is he?" Merrick's eyes came back to her, and for just a moment, just one, the mask slipped, and Hannah saw what was underneath it. And what was underneath it was a man who had just realized that the ranch he'd nearly finished stealing had gotten up off its deathbed, and that the thing that had raised it was standing right in front of him, with flour on her arms. "Well," he said, "I am glad to hear it. Truly. You know, Mrs. Calloway, a business growing this fast, it's going to need capital. Credit. Supply arrangements it can rely on. I'd be more than happy to extend the ranch a proper line of credit to support all this very favorable terms given our long friendship with Ethan. In fact, I've got some papers in the buggy I could leave with you. Just standard arrangements. Protect your interests. Protect everyone's interests." There it was. Hannah kept her face soft, but inside her something had gone sharp and clear and cold as spring water, because she understood exactly what those papers would be. Not credit. A trap. A signature that would tie the ranch's new life to Merrick's own hand, some clever clause buried in the middle, that would hand him control of the very business that was costing him money the way he'd tried to hand himself control of the land. He couldn't steal the ranch through the banknote anymore. The ranch was making money now, so he'd steal it through a contract instead. "Why, that's awful generous," Hannah said. "Papers, you say? I'd surely want to look them over careful. I'm slow with reading, Mr. Merrick, being a plain sort of woman. It might take me a good while to puzzle through it all." She smiled her dull, harmless smile. "Maybe you leave them with me, and I'll have a look when the cooking slows down." Of course. No rush at all." Merrick fetched the papers, a thick folded sheaf of them, and pressed them into her floury hands, and his soft, warm fingers held on to hers just a beat too long. "Take all the time you need, Mrs. Calloway. We're friends here. We're all friends." He climbed back up into his buggy. "Do give Ethan my best. And Mrs. Calloway." He paused, reins in hand, and his smile went thin at the edges. "Do be careful out here. It's a hard country. Terrible things happen to businesses that grow too fast. Fires, spoiled supply, bad luck of all kinds. A body never knows. It'd be a shame, a real shame, if all this good work came to nothing." He tipped his hat. "Good day," and he drove off. Hannah stood watching the dust of his buggy, the papers heavy in her hands, and Cole came up beside her wiping his hands on a rag. What did he want? To threaten me, Hannah said, politely. He just told me in the nicest words a man ever used that if I don't sign these papers and hand him my business, he's going to burn me out or poison the food or worse. She looked down at the folded sheaf. He knows. He knows what we're doing, and he knows it's costing him, and he knows this ranch ain't dying anymore. The quiet part's over, Cole. He's not waiting on the banknote now. He's going to come at us direct. Cole's face had gone hard. Then we ought to do exactly what we've been doing, only faster and more careful. And we ought to guard the food and the fires and the supply day and night, every one of us in shifts starting tonight. She folded the papers and tucked them into her apron. Because he wasn't bluffing about the fires and the spoiled supply. A man like that don't bluff. He warns. And a warning from Silas Merrick is a promise he intends to keep. She was right. It started 3 nights later, and it started with the well. Willis found it at dawn, going to draw the first water, and he came running back to the house white as a sheet. Ma'am, the well, somebody's been at the well. Hannah was down the stairs and out the door before he'd finished. The good well, the sweet water well they cooked from, and floating in it, bloated and stinking. A dead dog somebody had thrown down in the dark to foul the water. Poison the well, poison the food, poison the whole operation. And near enough it worked, because a kitchen with no clean water is a kitchen that can't cook. And a camp waiting on 240 meals is a camp that goes hungry, and a foreman who starts to wonder if the ranch wife bit off more than she could chew after all. Cole was for riding into town that hour and beating Silas Merrick to a pulp in the street. Sit down, Hannah told him. Ma'am, he poisoned our... I know what he did. Sit down. And there was something in her voice that put Cole back in his chair. You ride into town and thrash him, and you know what happens? You go to jail, and I lose my best man, and Silas Merrick tells the whole county that the Calloway Ranch is run by violent people who can't be trusted, and he wins. That's what he wants, Cole. He wants us angry. Angry people make mistakes. Angry people break the law. And the second we break the law, we hand him the one weapon he don't already have, and he'll use it to bury us. So we're not going to get angry. She stood up. We're going to get even. And there's a difference, and the difference is patience. And patience is the one thing that man can't stand. Because patience is what honest people have, and thieves never do. So what do we do about the water? We dig a new well and we haul from the creek in the meantime, and we don't miss a single meal at that camp. Not one. Because the second Buck Hollis goes hungry is the second Merrick wins, and I would sooner haul creek water on my own back than give that man the satisfaction. She was already moving. And we do one thing more. We write it down. The dead dog, the fouled well, the date, the time, everything, and we get every hand who saw it to make his mark on the paper as witness. Because Silas Merrick is building us a case, Cole, whether he means to or not, and I intend to keep every brick of it. They didn't miss a meal. They hauled creek water on their backs and boiled it clean, and the camp never went hungry, and Buck Hollis never knew how close it came, and Silas Merrick in town waited to hear that the Calloway operation had collapsed, and heard instead that the food had come on time, same as always. So he tried again. A supply of flour Hannah had bought turned up ruined weevil shot and damp sabotaged somewhere between the mill and the ranch by hands that had been paid to ruin it. She caught it before a bite of it reached the camp, because Hannah checked every sack that came onto her place with her own 2 eyes, having learned long ago to trust no one else's, and she pulled the ruined flour and paid out of the money box for good flour at a fair price from a mill 2 towns over that Merrick didn't own, and the camp never knew, and she wrote that down too. Then, the counterfeit money. This one was clever, and it near worked, and it was the first time Hannah felt real fear, because it wasn't aimed at the food or the well. It was aimed at her name. Somebody paid one of Hannah's own suppliers with counterfeit bills and made sure it looked like the bills had come from her, from the Calloway Ranch, from Hannah Calloway's own hand. And the supplier cheated, went to the county sheriff, and the sheriff came out to the ranch with a hard look on his face and questions about where a ranch wife was getting bad money. I never paid that man in my life. Hannah told the sheriff, calm as she could make herself, though her heart was going like a hammer. "I don't even buy from him. Check my books. I keep every receipt, every transaction, to see who I pay and how much. It's all right here. An honest set of books is the best friend an honest person's got. Sheriff and mine are open to you this minute." And she showed him. She showed him everything. The whole careful wall of paper she'd been building for weeks, every receipt and every witnessed page, and the sheriff went through it, and he was an honest enough man himself, and by the time he was done, he could see plain that whoever passed that counterfeit money, it wasn't the woman whose books balanced to the penny and who'd written down every dollar she'd spent since the day she arrived. "Somebody's trying to make trouble for you, Mrs. Calloway," the sheriff said, closing the ledger. "Somebody surely is." "You know who?" Hannah looked at him a long moment, and she made a decision she'd been turning over for days, which was that the time for playing dead was near done, that the wall of paper was near high enough, and that an honest sheriff was a thing worth more than gold to people fighting a thief who hid behind the law. "I've got an idea," she said carefully. "But I don't accuse a man without proof, Sheriff, and I don't expect you to hang one on my say-so. So I'll make you a deal instead. You keep an open mind. And when the day comes, and it's coming soon, that I lay proof on your desk, so plain a child could read it, you'll act on it. Fair and square, by the law. That's all I ask. Just that, when I bring you the truth, you'll be brave enough to do something about it, even if the man it points at is somebody this town's used to bowing to." The sheriff studied her. "You're a careful woman, Mrs. Calloway." "I've had to be. The world don't give careless women like me much room." "I'll keep an open mind," the sheriff said. "And when you bring me proof, real proof, I'll act on it. You have my word. I don't much like being used to do another man's dirty work, and somebody just tried to use me to do exactly that." He put his hat back on. "Whoever's behind that counterfeit money made a mistake sending me after you. I don't forget being made a fool of." He rode off and Hannah watched him go, and Cole came up beside her. "That was close," he said. "That was too close." Hannah's hands were shaking now that the sheriff was gone, and she could let them. "He aimed that one at my name, Cole. Not the food, not the well, me. Because a man like Merrick, he understands that you can haul creek water and buy new flour, but you can't buy back a good name once it's dirtied. He tried to make me a criminal so that anything I ever said against him after would be the word of a counterfeiter against the word of the finest man in Red Creek." She turned and looked toward town. "He's getting scared, Cole. That's what this is. A confident thief poisons a well. A scared one goes after your good name because a scared thief knows that sooner or later the honest folks are going to have to choose who to believe. He's trying to make sure that when that day comes, they don't believe me." "Will they?" Cole asked quietly. "Believe you over him. He's got money, ma'am. He's got the whole town used to tipping their hats to him. And you're the fat woman they laughed off the coach." Hannah's mouth twisted. "Say it. It's true. 6 weeks ago, this whole town would have believed Silas Merrick over me without a second thought." She looked out at the ranch at the fires, and the women working, and the wagon loading for the evening run. "But it ain't 6 weeks ago anymore, Cole. There's 14 women in this county earning honest wages who couldn't feed their babies before I came. There's a railroad camp full of men who eat like human beings now. There's a dozen hands paid up who tell every soul they meet what happened out here." Her voice steadied. "Silas Merrick's been buying this town's respect for years with money. And it turns out money buys a thinner kind of respect than a hot meal does. I've been feeding people coal. All these weeks I thought I was just saving the ranch. But I was doing something else too without meaning to. I was building the only thing that can beat a rich man in a town he owns." "What's that?" "People," Hannah said. "I was building people who'd stand up for me. And a rich man can buy a lot of things, Cole, but the day enough ordinary people decide they'd rather stand with the woman who fed them than the man who cheated them. That's the day all his money turns to paper. And that day's coming. He can feel it coming. That's why he's getting desperate. And a desperate man." She looked once more toward town. A desperate man is about to do something too big and too bold because he's run out of small and clever. And when he does, I'm going to be ready with a wall of paper and an honest sheriff and a whole county full of people he never once thought to count. She went back to work. But that night, after the fires were banked and the ranch was quiet, Hannah sat alone at the kitchen table with the folded sheaf of papers Silas Merrick had pressed into her floury hands, the credit agreement she'd told him she was too slow to read. She unfolded it under the lamp, and she read it, all of it, slow and careful, the way she read everything. And she was not slow at all. And by the time she reached the clause buried deep in the middle of it, the one written in language meant to slide past a tired eye, she understood the whole of what Silas Merrick had intended. The agreement gave him the ranch. Not the land this time, the business, the kitchen operation, the contracts, all of it. One signature, and every dollar Hannah's food brought in would have flowed by law into Silas Merrick's pocket, and she'd have been working herself and 14 women half to death to make a thief rich. And it would all have been legal signed and witnessed and airtight, because that was how the man worked. He didn't steal. He got you to hand it to him. Hannah folded the papers back up, and she did not throw them in the fire, though her hands itched to. She got up and she found a clean tin, and she put the papers inside it, careful as a woman handling something precious, because they were precious. They were the most precious thing she'd found yet. They were proof. Written in Silas Merrick's own hand on Silas Merrick's own paper was the exact shape of the theft he'd meant to commit, and he'd walked right up to her and pressed it into her hands himself, so sure she was too fat and too slow and too stupid to ever read it. And in his certainty that she was nothing, he had handed her the one thing that could destroy him. Hannah put the tin away safe. Then she sat back down at the table, and she pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her, and she began in her plain, careful hand to write it all out. Every price he'd overcharged, every freight tag she'd copied, the dead dog in the well witnessed, the ruined flour witnessed, the counterfeit money, and the sheriff's own visit. And now this, the credit agreement, the theft he'd tried to dress as a favor in his own hand. Brick by brick, the wall got higher, and somewhere in the writing of it, Ethan came down the stairs unable to sleep, and found her there bent over the lamp-lit page, and he stood in the doorway a while just watching her work. This woman who'd walked 10 miles in July, heat into a town that laughed at her, and had in 6 weeks quietly and patiently, and without ever once raising her voice, built the rope that was going to hang the most powerful man in the county. "You never stop," he said softly. Hannah looked up. "Can't afford to. He don't stop, so I don't either. You'll wear yourself down to nothing. There's a lot of me to wear down." She almost smiled. Then she didn't. "Ethan, sit down a minute. There's something you need to see, and you're not going to like it, and I'd rather you saw it from me than found it out some other way." He sat. She showed him the credit agreement. She showed him the buried clause. She watched his face as he read it and understood it. Watched the color climb up out of his collar. Watched his hands close slowly into fists on the tabletop. "He handed you this," Ethan said, low and terrible. "He drove out here and stood in my yard and smiled at you and handed you a paper that would have stolen everything you built, everything you saved. He tried to make you sign away your own." He couldn't finish. He stood up fast, the chair scraping. "I'll kill him. I swear before God, Hannah, you'll do no such thing." Hannah was up too, and she came around the table and she put both her hands flat on his chest, the way she had that first week, and she pushed him back down into the chair, not with strength, but with the sheer immovable calm of her. "Sit down, Ethan Calloway. Sit down and listen to me, because I need you to hear this, and I need you clear-headed to hear it." She crouched down in front of his chair, so she was looking up into his furious, grieving face. "He did hand it to me. That's right. And you know why? Because he looked at me and saw exactly what everybody's always seen. Something slow, something stupid, something to laugh at. He was so sure I was nothing that he put the proof of his own crime right into my hands and drove away smiling." Her voice dropped fierce and low. "Every man who ever underestimated me gave me something, Ethan, without ever knowing he did it. The town that laughed gave me a place that needed me. The men who mocked me gave me a crew that'd die for me now. And Silas Merrick, the smartest, wickedest, richest man in this whole county." She held up the folded agreement. "Silas Merrick just gave me the one thing I could never have gotten any other way. He gave me the truth in his own hand because he was too sure of my stupidity to imagine I could read." She stood slow, and her eyes were bright and hard as struck flint. "So no, you will not kill him. You will not lay a hand on him. Because I am going to do something to Silas Merrick that's 1,000 times worse than killing him, Ethan Calloway. I am going to let the whole world watch him lose." To me. To the fat woman he was too proud to fear. And when it's done, he's going to spend the rest of his days knowing that everything he stole and schemed and burned and poisoned to get, he lost it all in the end, because he couldn't imagine that a woman shaped like me could count. The lamp burned low between them. Ethan looked up at his wife, and whatever had been growing in him these 6 weeks, the thing he'd been half afraid to name, was plain on his face now, and he'd stopped trying to hide it. "Hannah," he said, "don't." She turned away, gathering her papers. "Not now. There's too much to do. Don't say a thing you can't take back in the middle of a war." "I'm going to say it when the war's over then." Hannah's hands went still on the papers. "If we win," she said quietly, not turning around. "When we win." She didn't answer that. She couldn't, because her heart was doing the fool thing again, the thing she'd told it not to do. And she was a woman who'd learned the hard way what happens when you let yourself hope for the one thing the world's decided you can't have. So she gathered her wall of paper and she put it away safe, and she banked the lamp, and she told Ethan Calloway good night, and she went up the stairs to bed on a ranch that had risen from the dead in the middle of a war she meant to win, carrying in her chest a hope she was still too scared to hold, and a certainty she'd have staked her life on. Silas Merrick had made his last small move. The next one would be big, and when it came, Hannah Brooks would be ready. The big move came 10 days later, and it came dressed the way all of Silas Merrick's moves came dressed, in the clean starched clothes of the law. It came in the form of a paper nailed to the door of the Calloway ranch house at dawn, and Willis found it, and Willis couldn't read it, so he brought it to Hannah with his hands shaking, and Hannah read it standing on her own porch in the early light, with the fires just being lit behind her. It was a lawsuit. Silas Merrick, doing business as Merrick Freight and Supply, was suing the Calloway Ranch for breach of contract, claiming that Ethan Calloway had entered into a binding supply agreement, that the ranch had defaulted on it, and that Merrick was owed the sum of $1,100 in damages, plus the seizure of ranch assets to satisfy the debt said seizure to include. And Hannah read this part twice. All cattle, all equipment, all structures, and all business contracts currently held by the Calloway Ranch. All business contracts. He was suing for the railroad contract. He'd found a way to take it in a courtroom that he couldn't take in her kitchen. "What's it say?" Cole had come up onto the porch, and behind him the women had stopped working, sensing the way a crew always senses when the boss has gone still. "Ma'am, what's it say?" "It says," Hannah said slowly, "that Silas Merrick has decided he can't beat us with dead dogs and bad flour, so he's going to beat us with a judge." She folded the paper. "He's suing us. Says Ethan signed a supply contract with him and broke it, and he wants $1,100 we don't have, and when we can't pay he takes the ranch. The cattle, the equipment, and the railroad contract. Everything. Legal. Signed by a judge. Just exactly the way he wanted to take it all along. Only now he's doing it in a courtroom where he thinks the deck's stacked his way." Ethan had come out onto the porch. He took the paper from her and read it, and his face went white and then red. "I never signed any supply contract," he said. "Hannah, I swear to you, there's no such contract. He's lying." "I know you didn't." "Then how can he? It's a lie. It's a bald-faced lie. Surely a judge would see. A judge sees what's put in front of him." Hannah's mind was already moving fast and cold, the way it moved when the stakes were highest. "And I'd bet the ranch that Silas Merrick has got a contract. A real piece of paper with your name on it, Ethan. Forged or slipped in among things you signed back when grief had you so low. You signed whatever he put in front of you and thanked him for the pen. He's had 2 years of you signing things you didn't read. You think he didn't keep something back for a day like this? Ethan sat down hard on the porch step. I did, he said hollow. God help me, I did. Those first months after Sarah, he'd bring papers, and I'd just sign. Credit things. Account things. I didn't read a one of them. I could barely see the page through. He put his face in his hands. He's had a signed paper in his pocket this whole time, waiting. Then we're going to court, Hannah said. The whole porch turned to look at her. Court, Cole said. Ma'am, he owns the court. He's had that circuit judge to supper. He's got money and lawyers and a signed paper with the boss's name on it, and we've got a box full of receipts and a fat woman who can add. You want to fight Silas Merrick on the one ground he's strongest, in a courtroom. Yes, Hannah said. Because it's the one place he can't burn down or poison or buy his way out of once the truth's on the table. Cole, listen to me. This is a gift. Don't you see it? He's been coming at us in the dark for weeks. Dead dogs and bad flour and counterfeit money, all of it in the shadows where I couldn't fight back proper because you can't take a dead dog to a jury. But now, she held up the lawsuit. Now he's dragged this whole fight into the light, into a courtroom, in front of a judge and witnesses and the whole town. He's put it on the record. And once a thing's on the record, Cole, her eyes were bright and hard. It can be answered, on the record, with proof. He thinks he's cornering me, but he just did the one thing I've been waiting for since the day I read his ledgers. He gave me a public place to lay down every brick I've been saving. You've got proof he forged that contract. Not yet, but I've got 6 weeks of his crimes written down and witnessed. And I've got a credit agreement in his own hand that shows exactly the kind of thief he is. And I've got a tin full of freight tags and prices that prove he's been robbing this ranch blind for 2 years. Hannah was already moving, already planning. And I've got one thing more, Cole. One thing that man never once counted on. What's that? I've got a lawyer to find and a case to build, and about 3 weeks to do it in, so quit asking questions and start saddling horses. We've got work. But finding a lawyer proved harder than Hannah had reckoned, and it was the first time since the dead dog that she felt the ground shift under her. Because every lawyer in Red Creek turned her away. She rode into town herself, and she went to the first lawyer's office, a Mr. Pruitt, whose shingle promised honest counsel, and Mr. Pruitt listened to her for exactly 4 minutes before he stood up and showed her the door. I'm afraid I can't take this, Mrs. Calloway. You haven't heard the half of it. I've heard enough to know who's on the other side. Silas Merrick holds paper on half the businesses in this town, mine included. A man doesn't saw off the branch he's sitting on. I'm sorry, I truly am, but I've got a family. And the door closed. The second lawyer said near the same thing. So did the third. By the time she'd been turned out of the fourth office, Hannah understood the full shape of what Silas Merrick had built in his years in Red Creek, which was a web fine and strong and near invisible, and every man of consequence in the town was caught somewhere in it, owing Merrick money or favors, or their own quiet secrets, and not one of them would risk crossing him to help a ranch wife nobody had respected 6 weeks ago. She stood in the street outside the fourth office, and for just a moment, one moment, the size of the thing she was fighting came down on her full weight, and Hannah Brooks felt something she hadn't let herself feel since the stagecoach. She felt small. Then she got angry, and angry was better angry she could use. Mrs. Calloway, she turned. A man had come out of the doorway beside the lawyer's office, an older man, spare and gray, and dressed plain with sharp eyes and a way of standing very still. She didn't know him. You've been turned out of 4 offices this morning, he said. I've been watching you do it from my window. Then you've had a fine entertainment, if you'll excuse me. I'm a lawyer, the man said. Hannah stopped. I'm retired, he went on, which is why I've got no branch for Silas Merrick to saw me off of. My name's Josiah Vance. I practiced law in Chicago for 30 years before my lungs sent me west for the dry air, and in those 30 years, I never once lost a case I believed in. And I've been sitting in this dusty town for 3 years, dying of boredom. His sharp eyes held hers. I've been hearing about you, Mrs. Calloway. The whole town's been talking about you for weeks. The woman who fed the railroad camp. The woman who paid off her ranch hands back wages. The woman Silas Merrick can't seem to shut down no matter what he tries. A thin smile. And now he's suing you. In a courtroom. Which means he's finally run out of the dark and stepped into the light where a man like me can get at him. He held out a spare, dry hand. I've been waiting 3 years for a fight worth having, Mrs. Calloway. I do believe you might be it. Come inside, tell me everything, and bring that box of receipts everybody says you carry.
As I see and I manner force.
Hannah looked at the outstretched hand. Why? She asked. Every other lawyer in this town's too scared. Why not you? Because I'm old, I'm dying, and I've got nothing left to be scared of, Josiah Vance said. And because 30 years ago in Chicago, a fat Irish washerwoman that everybody said was too stupid to matter took in a sick young lawyer nobody else would board and fed him back to health on nothing but potatoes and stubbornness. And I never forgot what I learned watching that woman work, which is that the world is full of fools who mistake the size of a person for the size of their mind. His eyes crinkled. I've been waiting a long time to pay that debt to somebody, Mrs. Calloway. You'll do fine. Now come inside before Merrick's man across the street runs to tell him you've found counsel. They worked for 3 weeks. Josiah Vance was a marvel, and Hannah, who'd spent a lifetime being the smartest person in rooms that refused to see it found for the first time in her life, a mind that met her own and matched it. He took her wall of paper and he showed her how to turn it from a pile of grievances into a weapon. He taught her the difference between knowing a man was a thief and proving it in a way 12 jurors couldn't unsee. And Hannah taught him things too, taught him how the money actually moved, how the freight worked, how 100 weight of feed became a stolen dollar, until the old lawyer sat back one evening and shook his head. You'd have made a hell of a lawyer, Mrs. Calloway. They don't let women like me be lawyers, Mr. Vance. No, he said. They don't. More fools them. He tapped the papers. This forged contract of his. That's the whole case. If the jury believes it's real, he takes everything, and all our receipts in the world won't matter, because a signed contract's a signed contract. If they believe it's forged, he spread his hands. Then he's not just lost his suit. He's a criminal. Forgery's a prison offense. So that's the ground we fight on. Not whether he overcharged you, whether that contract's real. And to win it, he looked at her. We've got to get our hands on the actual paper he's going to present and prove it false, and we won't see that paper until the day of the trial, when he lays it down in front of the judge. Which means we go in blind and we beat him live in the courtroom with the whole town watching. Can you do that, Mrs. Calloway? Can you win a thing you can't rehearse? Hannah thought about her whole life. Every room she'd walked into cold. Every judgment she'd overturned with nothing but her hands and her nerve. Mr. Vance, she said, I have spent 25 years winning things I couldn't rehearse. It's the only kind of winning I've ever done. The trial came on a Monday, and the whole county came with it. They came because Silas Merrick suing the ranch wife was the biggest thing to happen in Red Creek in years, and they came expecting a hanging. Expecting to watch the rich man crush the fat woman who'd gotten above herself, and the courtroom was so full that men stood along the walls and crowded the doorway and spilled out onto the steps. And they were all there. That was the thing Hannah noticed as she walked in, the thing that steadied her heart. The women were there, all 14 of them, Mary Dutton in the front row with her chin up. The ranch hands were there, Cole and Willis, and all of them scrubbed and grim in their Sunday best. And the railroad men were there, dozens of them, Buck Hollis among them, having walked off the line and lost a day's pay to sit in a hot courtroom for a woman who'd fed them. The town had come to watch Hannah lose. But the people she'd fed had come to stand with her, and there were more of them than the town had ever bothered to count. Silas Merrick sat at his table with 2 lawyers in fine suits from the city, and he smiled at Hannah across the room, warm and soft, and certain a man who had never once in his life imagined he could lose. The judge was a circuit judge named Harlan Crow, a heavy-set man with a careful face that gave away nothing, and Cole had been right that Merrick had had him to supper, and Hannah knew it, and she'd made her peace with it. You couldn't control the judge. You could only put the truth in front of him so plain and so public that even a bought man would find it hard to look away. Merrick's lawyers went first, and they were good city smooth and sure, and they laid out their case like laying bricks. Ethan Calloway had entered into an exclusive supply agreement with Merrick Freight. The ranch had then gone into direct competition, breaching that agreement, causing damages. And here the lead lawyer said producing it with a flourish was the contract itself, signed by Ethan Calloway's own hand, dated 2 years prior, witnessed and notarized. He laid it on the judge's bench, and Hannah, watching from her seat, felt Josiah Vance go very still beside her, and she followed his eyes to the paper, and she understood that the old lawyer had seen something. "Mr. Vance," she whispered. "The date," he breathed. "Look at the date he's claiming. 2 years ago, March. What about it?" "I don't know yet, but something. Keep your ear on it. When it's our turn, follow my lead, and when I look at you, you'll know it's time to do the thing only you can do." Merrick's lawyers finished, and they finished strong, and Hannah could feel the courtroom leaning their way, could feel the town's certainty hardening into fact. A signed contract, a notarized contract. What could a ranch wife and a retired lawyer possibly say against a notarized contract? Then Josiah Vance stood up. He stood up slow. An old man in a plain suit, and he shuffled to the front. And Merrick's city lawyers exchanged a look that was almost pity. "Your Honor," Vance said mildly, "might I examine the contract? These old eyes, you understand." He was handed the contract. He held it close to his face. He held it to the light from the window. He turned it over. He did all this slow, so slow, the courtroom began to shift and murmur, and Silas Merrick's smile stayed fixed, but his fingers began to tap on the table. "A fine document," Vance said at last. "Truly. Notarized, I see. By whom?" The lawyer answered. "A notary named Fenwick, since deceased." "Dead," Vance said. "How convenient. A witness who can't be questioned." He set the paper down. "And the date. March of 2 years past. The signing took place, your client claims, in the Merrick Mercantile in Red Creek." He turned to Merrick's table. "Do I have that right?" "You do," the lead lawyer said. "Ethan Calloway rode into town, went to the Mercantile, and signed this exclusive agreement in March 2 years ago. That is our position." Josiah Vance nodded slowly. Then he turned, and he looked at Hannah, and his old eyes were bright as a boy's, and Hannah understood that the moment had come. "Mr. Calloway," Vance said, still looking at Hannah but addressing Ethan, "would you tell this court where you were in March of 2 years ago?" Ethan stood confused. I don't rightly recall a specific think," Vance said gently. "March, 2 years past. Something happened that month, Mr. Calloway. Something a man doesn't forget." And Hannah watched it hit. Ethan watched the color drain out of his face, watched him grip the rail in front of him. "Sarah," he said hoarsely. "My wife. Sarah died in March, 2 years ago, the 4th of March. His voice broke. "I buried her on the 6th. I didn't, Your Honor. I didn't leave the ranch for near a month. I couldn't. I couldn't get out of bed. The whole town knew it. The preacher came out to me because I couldn't come to church. I didn't set foot in Red Creek that entire month. I couldn't have signed anything in that mercantile. I wasn't there. I wasn't anywhere. I was—" He stopped, unable to go on. The courtroom had gone dead silent. Josiah Vance let the silence stretch, let it fill the whole room, and then he said, quiet and terrible, "The contract is dated March 14th, 10 days after this man buried his wife. 10 days during which, as half this town can testify, Ethan Calloway did not leave his ranch, did not enter that mercantile, and was in no fit state to read a contract, let alone sign an exclusive agreement handing over his livelihood." He turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's entire case rests on a document he claims was signed on a day this man was prostrate with grief 10 miles away. We have a signature, yes, but we have a signature on a day the signer was demonstrably somewhere else, which leaves us only one conclusion." He looked at Silas Merrick. "This contract is a forgery, and a forged contract presented in a court of law is not a civil matter, Your Honor. It is a crime. The courtroom erupted. Judge Crow hammered for order, and Silas Merrick was on his feet, his lawyers pulling at his sleeve. And for the first time since Hannah had met him, the soft, warm mask was gone entirely, and what was underneath was ugly and afraid. "That proves nothing," Merrick's lawyer shouted over the din. "Perhaps the date is an error, a clerical mistake. The signature is genuine. The agreement is genuine." "Is it?" Josiah Vance said, and now he moved faster, a man closing a trap. "Then let us test how genuine. Your Honor, I'd ask the court's indulgence for a demonstration. The plaintiff claims this ranch owes him $1,100 and has defaulted on its debts. He has painted the Callaway Ranch as a failing operation and its mistress as a woman who overreached. I'd like to show this court the true state of the Callaway Ranch's accounts, kept every one by Mrs. Hannah Callaway herself. Mrs. Callaway, would you come forward?" Hannah stood. And the courtroom, which had come to watch her lose, watched her walk to the front. Instead, a big woman in her plain good dress, calm as still water, carrying a tin box. "Mrs. Callaway," Vance said, "you keep the books for the Callaway Ranch." "I do. Every dollar in and out since the day I arrived. And before you arrived. I reconstructed those too from the receipts Mr. Callaway kept in a drawer. It took me 3 nights. Tell the court what you found." And Hannah told them. She told them plain and clear in language a child could follow, no lawyer's tricks. No big words, just the simple arithmetic of a theft laid out one number at a time. She told them what Merrick charged for feed and what the feed cost. She told them the freight tags, the ones she'd copied with her own hand, and what Merrick charged to haul against what it cost him to haul. She held up receipts, and each one was a brick, and she laid the bricks one on top of another until the wall stood up in the middle of that courtroom for the whole town to see. 2 years of patient robbery made visible the exact machinery by which a smiling man had bled a grieving one near to death. $431, Hannah said, and 60 cents. That's what Silas Merrick overcharged this ranch over 2 years, above any honest price. I can show you every dollar of it. It's all here. And that's not the $1,100 he says we owe him, Your Honor. That's the $400 he stole from us. There's a difference, and the difference is the truth, and the truth's got a way of being smaller and heavier than a lie." She wasn't done. "And here," she said, and she drew out the credit agreement. The one Merrick had pressed into her floury hands is a paper Mr. Merrick brought to my ranch himself 3 weeks ago and asked me to sign. He said it was a favor, a line of credit. He was so sure I couldn't read it that he handed it right to me. She held it up. "It's got a clause in the middle, Your Honor, buried where a tired eye would skip it, that would have signed my entire business over to Silas Merrick for nothing. Every dollar my food brings in straight to his pocket, and me too dumb to know I'd done it. This is in his hand, his paper, his words. And I'd ask the court." She turned and looked at Silas Merrick, and she was not smiling. "Does that look like the paper of an honest man who was owed a fair debt? Or does it look like the paper of a thief who couldn't take a ranch one way, so he tried another and another and another?" The courtroom had gone from uproar to a silence so complete you could hear the flies. And Judge Harlan Crow, the bought man, the man who'd had Merrick to supper, sat looking down at the 2 papers in front of him. The forged contract dated 10 days after a man buried his wife, and the credit agreement in Merrick's own hand. And Hannah watched something happen in his careful face that she hadn't dared hope for. She watched an ordinary man decide he'd rather be honest than be owned. "Mr. Merrick," Judge Crow said slowly, not looking up from the papers, "your contract is dated the 14th of March. Can you produce a single witness, one who saw Ethan Callaway in your store that day? A day when, by the account of apparently half this county, he was 10 miles away in his bed, grieving his dead wife." Silas. Merrick's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His lawyers leaned in, whispering fast, but Merrick wasn't listening to them anymore because he was looking around the courtroom, and he was seeing for the first time what Hannah had built without his ever noticing. He was seeing 14 women who'd stand and swear. He was seeing a dozen ranch hands. He was seeing Buck Hollis and 40 railroad men who'd walked off the job. He was seeing a whole courtroom of ordinary people he'd spent years looking down on, and every one of them was looking back at him now, and there was no fear in any of their faces anymore, only a hard, clear waiting. He'd bought the town's respect with money, and he was watching it turn to paper in front of his eyes. "Your Honor," Merrick started, and his voice, that soft, warm voice, cracked. She's confused the accounts. She's a simple woman, she doesn't understand." "She understands better than any man in this room," Judge Crow said flatly. "Yourself included, and I'll thank you not to insult the intelligence of this court by suggesting otherwise. I've been watching Mrs. Calloway lay out figures for 20 minutes that your two city lawyers couldn't have followed, and she did it without a single note." He set down his gavel and folded his hands. "Now, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I'd advise you to think hard about your answer, because a great deal turns on it. Can you produce any evidence, any at all, that Ethan Calloway signed this contract on a day he was demonstrably at home burying his wife?" The whole courtroom held its breath, and Silas Merrick, cornered at last out of the dark and into the light with no well to poison, and no name to dirty, and no small clever move left to make, did the thing that cornered men do. He panicked. "He owes me!" Merrick shouted, standing, his lawyers grabbing at him. "That woman has cost me hundreds. That ranch was mine. It was going to be mine. I spent 2 years. He caught himself, but too late. Far too late, and the words hung in the air of that silent courtroom for every soul to hear. "I spent 2 years. "You spent 2 years doing what, Mr. Merrick?" Josiah Vance asked softly. Merrick's face had gone gray. "It was going to be yours." Vance pressed relentless now, the old wolf with the throat in his teeth. "The ranch. You spent 2 years. 2 years overcharging, wasn't it? 2 years of feed at double price and freight at triple, keeping a grieving man just alive enough to stay in debt. 2 years waiting for a banknote you'd made sure he couldn't pay, so you could take his land for the price of the debt. And then a woman came off a stagecoach and ruined 2 years of patient work in 6 weeks, and you couldn't stand it, so you fouled her well and ruined her flower and passed counterfeit money in her name, and when none of it worked, you forged a contract with a dead man's notary stamp and dragged her into this court to steal by law what you couldn't steal any other way." Vance's voice rang out. "That's what you spent 2 years doing, isn't it, Silas Merrick? You just told this entire county so yourself." The silence broke. It broke like a dam, the whole courtroom erupting at once, and over it all, Judge Harlan Crow's gavel came down once, twice, 3 times, and when order finally came, his face was no longer careful at all. It was hard as iron. "This court finds no merit whatsoever in the plaintiff's claim," Judge Crow said. "The contract presented is dated to a day the defendant has more than adequately shown he was elsewhere, and incapacitated by grief, and I find on the evidence and on the plaintiff's own statements, made in open court, sufficient cause to believe that document to be a forgery." He turned to the sheriff, the same sheriff who'd come out to the ranch about the counterfeit money, who was standing along the wall with his arms crossed and a look on his face that said he'd been waiting a long time for this. "Sheriff, I'm remanding Silas Merrick into your custody pending a criminal inquiry into forgery fraud and any other charges the evidence in Mrs. Calloway's possession may support. And from the look of that tin box, I expect it'll support a great many." The gavel came down a final time. "The suit is dismissed. The Calloway Ranch owes this man nothing. This court is adjourned." For one heartbeat, nobody moved. Then the courtroom exploded, and this time no gavel could have stopped it, because the people Hannah had fed were on their feet and shouting. The women weeping, and the ranch hands roaring, and the railroad men stamping the floor. And Silas Merrick stood in the middle of it all, with the sheriff's hand closing on his arm, watching everything he'd stolen and schemed and burned and poisoned for come apart in a single hour, undone by a tin box and a woman he'd been too proud to fear. He looked at Hannah as the sheriff led him past. He looked at her, and all the softness was gone, and what was left was a small, ugly, frightened man who had finally understood. "How?" he said. "Just that. How?" Hannah looked at him steady. "You handed it to me, Mr. Merrick," she said quietly. "All of it, every bit. You were so sure I was nothing that you never once thought to hide a single thing from me. You poisoned my well in front of witnesses. You put your theft in writing in your own hand. You forged a contract without even checking whether the man was in town that day. You did it all careless and bold, because you looked at me and saw somebody who didn't count." She leaned in just slightly, and her voice dropped so only he could hear it. "That was your whole mistake, and it was the same one everybody's made about me my whole life, and every last one of them lived to be sorry. You didn't lose to my lawyer or my books or the judge. You lost because you couldn't imagine that a woman shaped like me could beat you. And now the whole county's watching you learn different." They took him away, and Hannah Brooks stood in the middle of the roaring courtroom, and Ethan came through the crowd to her and Cole and Mary Dutton and Buck Hollis, and all of them pressing in, and the noise was deafening, and someone was crying, and someone was laughing, and someone kept shouting her name. Old Josiah Vance found her hand and shook it, his sharp eyes wet. 30 years I practiced law," he said, "and I never saw a finer piece of work than what you just did. And I didn't do it, you did. I just held the door." He gripped her hand hard. "That washerwoman in Chicago would have been proud to know you, Mrs. Calloway. She'd have said you were cut from the same cloth, and she'd have been right." Hannah couldn't answer him. Her throat had closed, because she was looking past him at the front row where the town's fine ladies sat, the same women who'd whispered on the boardwalk the day she stepped off the coach. "She won't last the week." Poor Ethan, desperate men make desperate bargains, and every one of them was staring at her now, with a look Hannah had waited her whole life to see, and had long ago stopped expecting. It wasn't respect exactly. It was too new for respect. It was the look of people rearranging the whole world in their heads all at once to make room for a truth they'd been too small to see. And then it was over, and the crowd was carrying her out into the light, out onto the courthouse steps, and the whole of Red Creek was there, and Ethan Calloway was beside her with his hand at the small of her back, steadying her, the way you'd steady something precious. And he leaned down close to her ear so she could hear him over the noise. "The war's over," Ethan said. Hannah turned and looked up at him. She remembered what he'd promised. "I'm going to say it when the war's over then." She remembered telling her own fool heart not to hope. She remembered a lifetime of being the one thing the world decided couldn't be loved. And she looked at this grieving man who'd become a living one. This man who'd been the only soul in the whole territory who hadn't laughed, standing beside her now, in front of the entire town, with his hand at her back like she was the most natural thing in the world to hold on to. "Not yet," Hannah said softly. "There's still the ranch to build, Ethan, bigger than before. And there's 14 women counting on the wages, and a railroad camp counting on the food, and half this county about to come asking if I'll feed them too." She almost smiled, and her eyes were bright and wet and steady. "The war's over, but the work's just getting started. And I came out here to work." Ethan looked down at her a long moment, and whatever was in his face, the whole town could see it, and not one of them was laughing now. "Then let's go home," he said, "and get to work." And Hannah Brooks, who had walked 10 miles in July heat into a town that laughed her off, the coach walked back out of it in the fall, with that same town watching on the arm of a good man, having beaten the richest thief in the county, with nothing but a tin box, a lifetime of being underestimated, and the plain, unkillable fact that she could add. She did not cry. She had promised herself a long time ago that she was finished crying. But she let Ethan take her hand as they walked to the wagon, and she held on to it the whole way home. They got to work. The morning after the trial, Hannah Brooks was up before the rooster, same as always, and she stood in the kitchen doorway looking out at a ranch that had won, and she felt the thing she always felt after a battle, which was not triumph, but the long list of what came next. "You beat the richest man in the county yesterday," Ethan said, coming down the stairs. "You're allowed to rest a day. Rest a day and lose 2. She was already tying her apron. 14 women are riding out here at dawn expecting work, and I aim for the work to be there. Merrick's in a cell, but his freight line's still running, and half the folks in town still owe him money. And there's a railroad camp 2 miles west that needs feeding, whether the man who used to feed it garbage is in jail or not." She handed Ethan a plate. "Eat. We've got a ranch to build, and now for the first time, Nobody's trying to burn it down while we build it. But the world had shifted in the night, and Hannah felt it before she understood it, and the first sign of it came up the road while the sun was still low. It was a wagon. It came from town, and Hannah watched it approach and set her jaw because she'd learned to distrust anything that came from Red Creek. But the man driving it wasn't Merrick's, wasn't anybody's. She recognized as an enemy. It was old Pruitt, the first lawyer who'd turned her out of his office. "We've got a family, I'm sorry." And beside him sat his wife, and in the back of the wagon were crates. Pruitt climbed down and took off his hat and stood there turning it in his hands the way Ethan used to a man come to say a hard thing. "Mrs. Calloway." "Mr. Pruitt, I turned you away." He said it plain, not making excuses of it, which Hannah respected in spite of herself. "3 weeks ago. You came to me for help, and I showed you the door, because I was afraid of Silas Merrick, and I've thought about little else since I watched you win yesterday." He looked at the ground, then back up. "My wife and I brought you some things, flour mostly, good flour from our own stores, and some sugar and coffee, for the cooking. It don't make up for the door I closed on you, nothing does. But I couldn't sit in that office one more morning knowing I'd been too much a coward to stand with the one honest fight this town's seen in years." He set his hat back on. "I'd take it kindly if you'd let me help now. Free. Any legal work you need from this day on. A man ought to be able to say before he dies that he stood on the right side of one thing." Hannah looked at him for a long moment. She could have been hard about it. Part of her wanted to be the part that remembered standing in the street outside 4 closed doors, feeling small. But Hannah had learned something in her 25 years that most people never learn, which was that a person who comes back to fix a thing they got wrong is rarer and more valuable than a person who never got it wrong at all. "Bring the flour into the kitchen, Mr. Pruitt," she said, "and tell your wife there's coffee on and she's welcome to it. We're about to feed 240 men, and there's always room for another pair of hands." She almost smiled. "As for the legal work, I've got Josiah Vance, and I don't expect he'll give it up now that he's finally got a reason to get out of bed in the mornings. But a ranch this size is going to have more paper than one old man can chase. I expect there'll be plenty for you if you truly mean it." "I truly mean it, ma'am." "Then we're square. Now carry that flour you're letting the morning get away from us." And Pruitt carried the flour, and his fine wife rolled up the sleeves of her good dress and worked a kettle alongside Mary Dutton. And that was the first of them, but it was not the last. They came all that week, and the week after. They came the way people come when the ground has shifted under a town, and everyone's scrambling to be found standing on the right side of it. The mercantile clerk who'd watched Merrick cheat for years and never said a word came out to confess what he'd seen, and Hannah took his statement and sent him to Vance to make it legal, because Merrick's criminal trial was coming, and every honest witness was a brick in that wall too. The women who'd whispered on the boardwalk came, some of them, not all, and they came sheepish and careful, and some of them came only to buy bread and stare, but they came, and Hannah sold them bread and took their money and did not once throw the boardwalk in their faces. Because she'd meant what she said in the courtroom. She hadn't come here to prove anybody wrong. She'd come here to make sure nobody stayed hungry. And the thing about feeding people, Hannah had always known, was that it changed them slow and sure from the inside out. A town that had laughed at a fat woman off a stagecoach could not go on laughing at the woman whose bread was on its tables, whose work had put wages in its widow's hands, whose courage had brought down the man. Half of them had secretly feared and owed and hated for years. The laughing had stopped in the courtroom. But it was the food in the weeks after that turned the silence, where the laughing had been, into something else entirely. It turned it into belonging. The ranch grew faster than Hannah could scarcely keep up with. Buck Hollis extended the railroad contract past its trial, and then extended it again, and then signed a full season. And word of the Calloway kitchen traveled up and down the line, the way good things travel among men who've been fed bad food too long. And soon there were other camps asking other outfits, a cattle drive passing through that paid good money for 3 days of hot meals, and left telling everyone they met about the woman east of Red Creek who cooked like somebody's mother. Hannah hired more women. She hired every woman in the county who needed the work, and when she ran out of women who needed it, she started training the ones who wanted it, and the Calloway Ranch kitchen became a thing. The territory had never seen a place where a woman the world had thrown away could walk in broke and broken and walk out 3 months later with wages in her pocket and her spine put back and her children fed. And Hannah watched it happen over and over, and every single time, it was the sweetest thing she knew, because that was the miracle she came to understand. Not the money, though the money came. Not the ranch, though the ranch flourished. The miracle was the widows. The miracle was Mary Dutton, who'd answered her own door with a baby on her hip and a flat dead look in her eyes and no way to feed her children, standing 6 months later at the head of her own crew, teaching new women the work, calling out orders in a voice that had learned it could be obeyed. A woman who'd been given up for lost by an entire town and had found in a ranch kitchen the thing that had been stolen from her along with her husband, which was the plain human dignity of being needed. "You did this," Mary said to Hannah one evening, the two of them alone after the crews had gone looking out at the banked fires. "All of us. You know that. Every woman out here would have been on charity, or worse if you hadn't come. My babies would have—" She stopped. "You saved us." "I hired you," Hannah said. "There's a difference, and you do well to know it. I didn't save you, Mary. I gave you work, and you saved yourself every day with your own 2 hands. Don't you ever let anybody, me included, tell you a person handed you your own dignity. You earned it. You were always worth earning it. This ranch just finally let you." "Still," Mary said, "I know what you did. Then do the same for the next one," Hannah said. "That's all the thanks I'll ever want. When some broke, beaten woman comes to that door with the look you had, you remember what it felt like to be her, and you put a ladle in her hand and a wage in her pocket, and you don't ever once make her feel like less. You do that and we're square forever. Now go home to your children. It's late, and they'll want their mother." And Mary Dutton went home to her children, who ate every night now, and slept warm, and had a mother who'd remembered how to stand up straight. Silas Merrick's criminal trial came in the deep of winter, and it did not last long. Hannah's tin box saw to that. The forged contract, the notary conveniently dead the credit agreement in Merrick's own hand. The counterfeit money traced back at last through the sheriff's patient work to a man Merrick had hired. The freight tags, the ledgers, the mercantile clerk's confession, the whole wall of paper Hannah had built. Brick by patient brick over months of quiet nights when everyone thought she was only cooking. It came down on Silas Merrick like a mountain. And there was nothing his city lawyers could do, because you cannot argue a jury out of numbers, and Hannah's numbers were plain as scripture. He was convicted on every count: forgery, fraud, the hiring of men to poison a well and pass false money. The judge who'd once had him to supper gave him the full weight the law allowed. And when they led Silas Merrick out of that courtroom for the last time in chains, now bound for the territorial prison, he did not look soft anymore, and he did not smile. And he was at the last exactly what he'd always been, underneath the warm handshake and the kind words. A small man who'd mistaken other people's trust for something he was owed, and had spent it all and had nothing left. He looked for Hannah in the courtroom. She was there. She'd come to see it finished, because a thing worth starting was worth seeing through to the end. And Merrick found her face in the crowd, and whatever he'd hoped to see there, some gloating, some triumph he could hate her for, he didn't find it. Hannah just looked at him steady, the way she'd have looked at any sad, ruined thing, and there was no hate in it. And somehow, that was worse for him than hate would have been. "You could have been rich honest," she said to him quiet as they led him past. "That's the part I can't ever make sense of. You were smart enough. You had the store, the freight, the whole town's trust in your hand. You could have built something real and slept easy every night of your life. And instead, you spent all that cleverness stealing from a grieving man and burning out a ranch full of widows." She shook her head slow. "That's the saddest thing about you, Silas Merrick. It was never that you couldn't win honest. It's that you never once tried." They took him away, and Hannah did not watch him go. She had a ranch to run. A year to the day after she'd stepped off that stagecoach into a town full of laughter, Hannah Brooks stood on the porch of the Callaway ranch house and looked out at a thing she'd built with her own 2 hands, and it did not look like the dying place she'd walked into. The fences stood straight and new. Fat cattle grazed pastures gone green with the spring cattle that had been fed and tended back to health with the profits of a kitchen. The bunkhouse had a new roof and new beds, and men in it who were paid on time every week cash money, and who'd stopped being men who waited to lose and become men who woke each morning glad of the day. 2 great new kitchen buildings stood where the old one had been, and smoke rose from both. And the sound that came off the Calloway Ranch, now from dawn to dark, was the sound of women working and laughing and calling to one another, the sound of a place fully roaringly alive. The largest independent food business in the whole territory, folks were calling it now. Feeding railroad camps and cattle drives and half the frontier towns for 100 miles. And people came from a long way just to eat there, just to see it, just to buy a loaf of the bread everybody talked about, and shake the hand of the woman who'd become without ever meaning to something of a legend. And the same townspeople who'd once whispered she wouldn't last the week, now pointed the way to Calloway Ranch, when strangers asked where a body could get a decent meal in these parts. "East of town," they'd say. "Follow the creek, you'll smell it before you see it." And then, because people are people, and love to be near a thing that matters, they'd add quiet and proud like it was theirs. "That's Hannah Calloway's place. If you're hungry, that's where hope is served." Ethan found her on the porch that evening, as the sun went down behind the Wyoming mountains the way it did, and he came and stood beside her. And for a while neither of them said anything, because they'd reached the kind of easy silence that only comes to 2 people who've fought a war side by side and won it. The grief had gone from Ethan, or not gone grief. Like that never fully goes, but it had made its peace. He was a whole man now, a man who laughed easy, and worked glad, and slept sound, and the hands who'd known him before the stagecoach came would tell you plain that Hannah Calloway hadn't just saved the ranch. She'd saved the man who owned it, dug him up out of the grave he'd been living in, and given him back to himself. "You remember what I said?" Ethan finally spoke. "The day of the trial, on the courthouse steps." "I remember. I said I'd say it when the war was over, and you said not yet. There's still the ranch to build." He turned to look at her. "Well, look out there, Hannah. The ranch is built. Bigger than before, just like you wanted. The women have their wages. The camp has its food. Half the county's come asking, and you've fed every one of them. Merrick's in prison. The war's over. It's been over a good while now." His voice went low and steady. "So I reckon I've waited long enough." Hannah's heart did the fool thing it always did, but she didn't push it down this time. She'd stopped pushing it down somewhere in the winter, when she wasn't looking. "Ethan, let me say it. I've earned the saying of it." He took off his hat, and he held it in his hands, and Hannah understood that a year ago he'd turned that same hat in those same hands like a man at a funeral, and now he held it like a man at the start of something. "I sent away for a wife because I was drowning, and a man in a marriage bureau told me a married man could get a loan. That's the ugly truth of how you came to be here, and you know it, and I've been ashamed of it every day since I understood what I'd have thrown away if you'd never come." He looked her full in the face. "You walked into the worst thing my life had ever been, a dying ranch, and a dead man walking around inside it, and you didn't flinch. You fed my men. You saved my land. You fought a thief who'd have crushed anybody else in this county, and you beat him with a tin box and your own 2 hands, and somewhere in all of it Hannah Brooks, without my ever deciding to, without my even knowing it was happening until it had already happened all the way through." His voice caught, and he let it. "I fell in love with you. Not the wife I sent for. You. The woman you are. The bravest, kindest, hardest-headed, most impossible woman I've ever known or ever will." The sun sat red on the mountains. "I know what you told yourself." Ethan went on gentler now. "I heard you that night in the kitchen when you thought I'd gone up. Don't you dare hope for that. Not that. That's the one they never let you keep. I heard you tell your own heart not to want to be loved." His jaw worked. "And I have spent every day since trying to figure out how to prove to you that whoever taught you that was wrong, that the world was wrong, that every single soul who ever looked at you and decided you couldn't be loved was as blind and as foolish and as small as Silas Merrick, and just as certain to be proved wrong in the end. He reached out and took her hand, the way he had walking to the wagon after the trial. Careful, like it was precious, because it was. You told me once you came here, not for romance, but because being needed was the closest thing to being loved the world ever let you hold. Well, I'm standing here telling you the world was wrong about that too. You're not just needed on this ranch, Hannah, you're loved on it. By me. And I mean to spend whatever years I've got left making sure you never again lie awake in the dark, telling your own heart it's got no right to hope. Hannah Brooks, who had walked 10 miles in July, heat into a town that laughed her off the coach, who had faced down poisoned wells and forged contracts, and a courtroom that came to watch her lose, who had not cried in longer than she could count, because she'd promised herself she was finished. Stood on the porch of the ranch she'd saved and felt her eyes go hot and full. I told myself I was done crying, she said, and her voice cracked all the way down the middle of it. I know. A long time ago, I promised myself. I know, Hannah. Some promises, she said, a person's allowed to break. And Hannah Brooks cried. She cried the way a body cries when it's held something back for 25 years, and finally sets it down. Not out of sorrow, but out of a relief so deep it has no other way out. And Ethan Calloway pulled her in and held her against him on that porch while the sun went down, this big, brave, impossible woman who'd saved his life without ever once asking to be saved herself. And he held her while she wept, and he did not tell her to stop, and he did not think her weak for it. And that more than anything he'd said was how she knew it was true. When the tears had run their course, she pulled back and wiped her face with the heel of her hand and looked up at him. And there was something in her face that the town of Red Creek had never once seen there in all the year they'd watched her, because she'd never once let them see it. There was hope. You're sure, she said. Look at me, Ethan Calloway. Look close. You're a good-looking man who could have any thin, pretty woman in this county now that you're back among the living, and half of them would come running if you crooked a finger. You're sure it's me you want to wake up next to the rest of your life? Sure it's me, and not just gratitude wearing love's coat. Hannah! Ethan almost laughed, and there was something wet in it. I have spent a year watching you outthink lawyers and outwork men half your age and outlast a rich man's every dirty trick. I've watched you take 14 broken women and hand them back their lives. I've watched you turn a dead ranch into the beating heart of this whole territory, and I've watched you do all of it without ever once asking a soul to thank you for it. He cupped her face in his rough hand. You think I want thin and pretty? Thin and pretty couldn't have done 1 hour of what you've done. I don't want thin and pretty, Hannah. I want the strongest, smartest, bravest person I've ever met, and by the grace of God that person is standing right in front of me. And I'd have to be as big a fool as this whole town was to want anything else. It's you. It was always going to be you. From the first night you set that pot down on my table so hard, the cups jumped and told 12 men not to ever tell you what you couldn't do. He smiled, and it was the whole smile now, the one that had been ghosting around the edges of his mouth for a year. It's you, Hannah Brooks. Nobody else. Not ever. And Hannah Brooks, who had come to Red Creek not for romance and had found it anyway, who had come to be needed and had ended up loved, reached up and put her hand over his, where it cupped her face, and she said the truest thing she'd ever said in her life. Then it's you two, she said. God help us both. It's you too, Ethan Calloway. They were married proper that spring in the little church in Red Creek that had once emptied its whispers onto the boardwalk at the sight of her. And this time the whole town came, and this time nobody laughed. They came because they wanted to, because somewhere in a year of eating her bread and taking her wages and watching her stand where no one else in the county had dared to stand, the people of Red Creek had come to understand what they'd nearly missed the day they laughed her off that coach. They filled the church to the rafters and spilled out onto the steps, the ranch hands and the railroad men and the 14 women. Mary Dutton weeping openly in the second row, and old Josiah Vance standing up in the front, gray and spare and beaming, giving the bride away himself because there was no one else to do it, and he'd asked for the honor with tears in his sharp old eyes, and coal-hard mean grieving. Cole, who'd carried her water that first night and cried into her stew, stood up as best man for a boss he'd have died for. And when the preacher asked, "Was there any who objected?" Cole turned around and looked out at the whole packed church with a grin, daring a single soul to make a sound. Nobody did. They lived a long time, the two of them, and they built something that outlasted them both. The Callaway Ranch grew into a thing the territory told stories about for generations, and the food business Hannah built fed the frontier as it grew from wilderness into towns into a state. And long after the railroad camps were gone and the cattle drives had ended, there were families across 3 counties who could tell you that their grandmother had earned her first honest dollar in Hannah Callaway's kitchen, had stood up straight for the first time in her life with a ladle in her hand, had learned there that a woman the world threw away could build a life the world would one day envy. Hannah trained 100 women and more across the years, and every one of them she sent out with the same words, the words she'd said to Mary Dutton on that first night by the banked fires. Do the same for the next one. Remember what it felt like to be her. Put a ladle in her hand and a wage in her pocket, and don't ever once make her feel like less. And they did, those women, and the women they trained did the same on. Down through the years, a long, unbroken line of kindness passing hand to hand across the whole frontier. All of it flowing out from one ranch kitchen and one woman the world had been fool enough to underestimate. She never did grow thin, and she never once wished to, because she'd learned the truth of herself long before Red Creek ever laid eyes on her, and Red Creek had only in the end caught up to what Hannah Brooks had always known. That the size of a person had nothing to do with the size of what they could do. That the ones the world laughs at are only the ones it hasn't yet learned to fear. And that a body's worth was never a thing you could weigh on any scale ever built, but was measured instead, and only in the lives that were warmer and fuller and braver for that body having passed through the world. On the last good evening of a long, full life, an old woman sat on the porch of the Callaway Ranch with her husband's hand in hers, and she watched the smoke rise from kitchens that had been feeding the hungry for 40 years, and would go on feeding them long after she was gone. And she thought about a scared young woman with one suitcase and $40 and a marriage contract she barely understood stepping down off a stagecoach into a town that laughed. They'd said she couldn't even cook. And Hannah Brooks, who had fed an entire territory, who had saved a ranch and a man and 14 women and 100 more after them who had come west to be needed, and had found herself loved beyond anything the world had ever let her hope for, looked out at everything she'd built out of almost nothing. And she smiled, and she knew with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who had proved it 1,000 times over across a lifetime, the one truth that had carried her the whole long way. They had been wrong about her. They had been wrong about her from the very beginning, wrong in every particular wrong. The way small, frightened people are always wrong about the ones too large of heart for them to measure. And she had spent her whole life turning their wrongness into bread, and their laughter into wages, and their scorn into the warmest, fullest, most beloved kingdom the frontier had ever known. And that was the truth of Hannah Brooks, first, last, and always. She was never the woman they said she was. She was so much more than they could ever have imagined, and she always had been, and the whole world was fed and warmed and made better for the day. She stepped off that stagecoach and refused once and for all, and forever, to be anything less than everything she was.